Up next, the U.S. Agency for International Development's Food for Peace program is the focus of a Senate Foreign Relations hearing. We'll hear from the program's acting director, a representative from Catholic Relief Services, and an official from the Government Accountability Office. This runs about an hour and a half.
Foreign Relations Committee will come to order. We are currently facing a historic humanitarian crisis with over 800 million people worldwide who are in need of food aid. The United States continues to be the world leader in providing more than a third of all emergency food aid, over $2 billion annually. Sadly, despite our generosity, there are shortfalls from what is needed due to other donor nations not fully meeting the challenge. In next year's Farm Bill deliberations, we have an opportunity to do more without having to spend more money. A little over half of our food aid is provided through the Farm Bill, saddling our Food for Peace program with U.S. commodity and cargo preference requirements. The Farm Bill requires aid to be sourced almost entirely from U.S. farmers, half of which must be shipped on U.S.-flagged vessels according to cargo preference rules. These restrictions result in spending as little as 35 to 40 cents on a dollar on food. Let me say this one more time. Because of these utterly ridiculous requirements, only 35 to 40 cents of each dollar is actually used to provide food to people who are starving. If we relax the commodity preference to match the needs overseas, the overhead costs would drop dramatically. U.S. farmers would still play a vital role in the program, and we would free up over $300 million in taxes to be used to feed up to 9.5 million more starving people each year. One of the major obstacles to modernizing Food for Peace are those who continue to support and profit from cargo preference rules. Representatives of the shipping industry claim that food aid has a significant impact on U.S. maritime jobs and our military sea lift capacity to move defense materials overseas. I've asked our witnesses, we have two panels today, to provide the committee with facts, analysis, and sound research to determine whether this is true. For example, the industry argues that 40 ships and 2,000 mariners needed for military sea lift are at stake should we reduce the amount of food aid we ship from the U.S. A simple review of USAID data shows that in 2016, only 5 U.S. flagged ships out of a fleet of 175 arguably rely on food aid shipments to stay afloat. Let me say this, only one of which is even capable of carrying military cargo. One. Some have even questioned why we have cargo preference at all, since there is little supporting evidence that the requirement effectively secures naval sea lift capacity. For example, the vast majority of food aid is moved on ships incapable of moving military cargoes, and the ones that can already receive a $5 million a year subsidy. According to Navy officials briefing our committee earlier this year, we maintain a strategic sea lift officer reserve program that can meet virtually all of our mariner sea lift mobilization requirements. We also cannot forget the human toll of commodity and cargo preferences, with millions of people who go hungry each year unnecessarily because of these two ridiculous requirements that Congress places on food aid. One of our witnesses, Dr. Barrett of Cornell University, will testify later that research suggests at least 40,000 children die annually who would otherwise be saved if we reformed this system. There are few areas in government where we can have more impact on lives without additional resources than by modernizing the Food for Peace program. I urge all of my colleagues today to listen to today's testimony, work with us to make common sense changes in food aid that are long overdue. And let me just say this, I spoke to the Tennessee Farm Bureau each state has one. The audience was aghast at the fact that here in Washington, those people who, quote, represent them, with 0.1% of all U.S. ag exports going to this, not 1%, 0.1%, they were aghast at the fact that Congress had people up here in the name of protecting them. These are good people. They care about their communities. They care about people around the world. They were aghast at the fact that Congress had these ridiculous requirements in place and that people are starving because of these ridiculous requirements, when their goal is to feed America and to feed the world. With that, Ranking Member Cardin.
Well, Mr. Chairman, first, thank you for conducting this hearing. I think every member of this committee very much admires your passion on this issue and your leadership on this issue so that America can more effectively deal with world hunger issues. So we're proud to be part of your team to figure out a better way to get this done. And I think we need to understand the dimensions of this problem. I don't think any of us have experienced the real fear of hunger. Maybe because of our schedules we might miss a meal, but we don't understand what 815 million people globally face, which is a real fear of whether they will be able to get the nutrition they need in order literally to survive. Our world produces enough to feed all of its inhabitants. However, as we sit here, over 20 million people in 4 countries alone, just 4 countries, South Sudan, Nigeria, Somalia, and Yemen, are threatened by famine. A declaration of famine, as is the case in South Sudan, means people, especially women and children, are dying of hunger. Dying of hunger. The UN has called this the largest humanitarian crisis since 1945. The chairman's right. This is an urgent issue and needs to be dealt with. And Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that you and Senator Coons recently traveled to some of these countries to learn how the U.S. can best help those in need and are working on legislation to modernize and reform the food aid programs. You've gone there, and they're not easy places to get to. And we appreciate very much you taking the time to better understand by seeing the circumstances on the ground. I agree with you that our values as Americans and our place as leaders in the global community means the United States must commit to improving how the world is tackling this crisis. That means taking a close and honest look at how our policies towards food aid and improving global food security can be most impactful. And it means ensuring adequate funding for these programs. Adequate funding is important. Yes, you can reform and you can get better use of our funds, but it does require that we put up the resources. For more than 60 years, the United States has played a leading role in tackling hunger. We are still by far the world's largest food aid donor. In cases of disaster, natural or man-made, the American people are the most generous in the world. As we look to modernize the food aid programs, we should not only look at the shipping requirements, but also address issues related to prepositioning food aid in the region, concerns about monetization practices, options for increasing cash-based options, and support local and regional purchasing programs. We also should be sure to adequately fund our food security efforts that invest in local agricultural markets, such as Feed the Future, which helps mitigate the need for emergency food aid by creating resiliency and helps foster healthier, thriving communities. Our agricultural development programs require adequate funding. And as we embark on this effort to reform our food aid program, I want to point out that there will always be a place for food grown in the United States to be shipped abroad. Sometimes it's simply not possible to buy enough to address the needs in the local markets. Our focus today should be on giving aid distributing organizations on the ground the flexibility to use the best methods for each situation. With a tailored approach aimed at providing as much choice as possible, we can feed more people and save more lives. I do look forward to all of our witnesses, but I want to particularly acknowledge Bill O'Keefe, who's here, Vice President for Government Relations for the Catholic Relief Services. We take particular pride because the Catholic Relief Services presence in Baltimore. We admire greatly the work that they do globally, and it's glad to have him on our second panel.
Thank you very much. I saw Bill earlier this morning, and our other witness at the second panel. Thank you for your comments. Our first witness is the Acting Director of the Office of Food for Peace at USAID, Matthew Nims. Director Nims manages both of our international food assistance programs, a reformed emergency food security program we authorized last Congress, and the unreformed Food for Peace program is authorized in the Farm Bill. We thank you for being here. I know you understand you can summarize your comments in about 5 minutes. Any written materials you have without objection will be entered into the record. And if you would begin, we'd appreciate it. Again, thank you for being here, and thank you for your service to our country.
Chairman Corker, Ranking Member Carden.
Mike.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Chairman Corker, Ranking Member Carden, and members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to come speak with you today about how to increase the cost effectiveness and agility of the Food for Peace program. We are grateful for your support to humanitarian efforts at this critical moment in history. As the committee members know, we are facing unprecedented levels of global food security. Echoing some of the comments on the opening statement of Ranking Member Carden, in conflict zones of South Sudan, Somalia, Nigeria, and Yemen alone, more than 20 million people are at risk of severe hunger or starvation. The United States has provided life-saving humanitarian assistance, helping to stem malnutrition, avert famine, and contain deadly diseases like cholera. Yet these four countries represent only a small part of the global food insecurity. Global hunger increased in 2017 for the first time in more than a decade, and food insecurity now affects 11% of the world's population. That's 815 million people going to bed hungry each night, or more than twice the population of the United States. In response to this great need, the Office of Food for Peace has provided life-saving food assistance to people in need in about 50 countries this year. Providing food assistance to the world's most vulnerable people reflects America's compassion and generosity. It is also critical to our national security. Where hunger persists, instability grows. U.S. food assistance in all of its forms contributes to a more stable world where people have the chance to lead healthy, productive lives. Given these global challenges and the need for us to improve the cost effectiveness and efficiency of Food for Peace programs, the logistics is incredibly important. Today I will focus on one challenge to improving efficiency: how we procure and ship U.S. commodities through the Title II program. Under Title II of the Food for Peace Act, we receive funds to purchase U.S. commodities such as wheat, rice, and sorghum, and certain specialty nutritional products to meet emergency food needs. Working closely with our partners, such as Catholic Relief Services and the UN World Food Program, we identify when and where U.S. commodities are needed, and we arrange for these commodities to be shipped from U.S. ports to their destination. Upon arrival, the food is distributed in various ways, always prioritizing the most vulnerable, usually children under 5, pregnant and lactating women, the elderly, and other vulnerable populations. The shipment of commodities overseas is a critical step in the Title II process. The Cargo Preference Act requires that at least 50% of the gross tonnage of U.S.-financed ocean cargoes must be transported on U.S.-flagged, privately owned commercial vessels to the extent those vessels are available at fair and reasonable rates. However, in many cases, Food for Peace has found the U.S. flag fee is not always available to provide the services needed. For example, in fiscal year 2017, we did not receive a single offer from U.S. flag vessels on over 250,000 metric tons of commodity that we offered. The majority of our bulk cargoes is carried by only 4 U.S. flagship, which can contribute to USAID's challenges to respond in emergencies. Another obstacle is the lack of direct shipping services to certain regions. Food for Peace destinations and U.S. flag vessel routes are not always well matched. Regular U.S. flag services do not exist to most of our destination ports directly, particularly in Western and Southern Africa, which requires USAID rely on a hub and spoke system to deliver our U.S. in-kind food aid. Finally, there is the matter of cost. In fiscal year 2016, it cost Food for Peace substantially more per metric ton for U.S. flag vessels compared to foreign flag vessels. This cost differential has significant impacts on programs, in particular for humanitarian operations like ours, already struggling to keep pace with the unprecedented levels of global hunger. Cargo preference requirements mean that we pay millions more for ocean freight out of the Food for Peace program budget each year. Now more than ever, every dollar counts. Our primary concern at Food for Peace is to save lives, relieve suffering, and reach people in need. To do this the best we can, we are constantly looking to improve our performance to reach as many people as possible and to ensure we make the most cost-effective use of American tax dollars. Thank you again for your invitation here today, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you. I typically don't ask questions first. I am today. I'll try to be brief. Maritime industry claims that 40 U.S. flagged ships rely upon food aid shipments in order to stay in business and provide our military with sea lift capacity. But according to your data from last year, I just want to reiterate some of the things you're saying. 5 ships carried 66% of all food aid on U.S. flagged ships under the cargo preference law that you're unfortunately having to adhere to. The rest of such food aid was spread amongst 19 ships, so that's just 24 total ships with only 5 that rely arguably on food aid to stay afloat. Is it typical for such a small concentration of U.S. flagged vessels to carry such a large percentage of U.S. food aid?
Thank you for that question, Senator. In the last 2 years especially, that has been the norm, where a very small number of ships carry the majority of our bulk cargo. To be clear, 2016, we had 5 ships that carried the majority of that, but in the middle of the year, one of those ships was scrapped by industry, so it has become 4 ships that carry over 60% of the bulk cargo, of our cargo.
But, why is that the case? Because we're having to rely on U.S. flagged ships. There's a concentration in these 2 companies, if you will, on these ships. Is that correct? And there's just 2 companies that provide those 4 ships?
Those 2 ships, those 4 ships, or 5 ships, those 4 ships are owned by 2 companies. They do have the appropriate ships to carry U.S. cargo, and we are not receiving other offers from other shipping lines available. So they really—
If they weren't U.S. flagged, would you receive other offers, do you think, from other companies?
Most assuredly, yes. Just to put it in perspective, we had 26 ships that we used for U.S. flag. We had over 90 ships that we went foreign flag.
Okay. And of the 5 U.S. flagged, or 4, with 1 being scrapped, how many are even capable of providing sea lift capacity for military cargo?
So I would defer that question to my military colleagues as far as what's military useful or not. I will say that what's useful and has proven useful for Title II are the bulk shipments, the bulk carriers.
Yeah. Well, let me answer it for you. It's 1. How much more does it cost you to ship on U.S. flagged vessels than foreign flagged vessels?
Using 2016 as our, to give you that answer, we paid, and on average per ton, $135 per metric ton for U.S. ships. On foreign flag ships, we paid on average $65 per ton.
I think I'll stop. I can't imagine why we cause people around the world to starve to support 2 companies based in New York. Somebody else may have a rational reason for that, but I'll defer to the ranking member.
Mr. Nims, I want to go into the areas of reform that we had in the 2014 Farm Bill that allowed additional flexibility in regards to in-kind and commodity-based food aid, and allowed the use of the USAID International Disaster Assistance accounts for emergency food security programs. And could you just comment as to those changes, how they have impacted our ability to respond to the global needs?
Thank you for the question, Senator. The addition or the emergence of the International Disaster Assistance funds to Food for Peace has been instrumental for us to combat food insecurity around the world. There are several areas where in-kind U.S. food assistance is not the appropriate tool to use to fulfill our mission. Primary amongst those would be Syria. Both inside and outside Syria, in-kind Title II food assistance would not have an impact that our voucher and cash-based assistance have allowed. In addition, IDA is also helping us to lead innovation. For example, for voucher programs that we've set up outside of Syria, we have developed retinal scans to ensure that the people we've identified are those people and are receiving those food vouchers. In addition, it has allowed us to buy food locally and even regionally to be able to respond on a much more quick basis. In the emergency fear, being able to move the appropriate commodity to the place in a small amount of time is crucial to save lives. IDA has given us that flexibility to do exactly that.
Our ultimate goal is to have self-sustaining countries on their own food supply, resiliency. Can you just tell us how the flexibilities that you had, the use of these funds, are they being targeted so that we do aim to achieve the resiliency so that the local communities can, in fact, one day be able to handle their own food needs?
Thank you for that question as well. Most definitely, yes. When we use the IDA funds, we do a market-based assessment to ensure that the markets are able to support this. And then sometimes by incentivizing the market, we're actually making it stronger to allow the area affected by this crisis to more quickly recover. So in a sense, instead of bringing in where it's inappropriate foreign commodity into a system, disrupting, having negative market impact, we're actually incentivizing the market, either through local procurement or a voucher type program. So most definitely, these programs are geared, the IDA gives us the flexibility where it's appropriate. And our teams do the studies to ensure that this is the case. Where appropriate, we are actually strengthening marketing, getting that group back on their feet more quickly.
I think I understand why we do monetization, that this is a source of funds, and otherwise you can't get the funds unless you use this method. It seems terribly inefficient to ship food overseas, sell it in order to get money for the programs that you need. Isn't there a better way?
Monetization is part of the Farm Bill at this time, and we are the Farm Bill stipulates that we do 15% to do monetization, and it has been a way to generate those crucial funds, as you've said. We are losing, on average, 75 cents on the dollar, if not more, when we had done traditional monetization programs in the past. Right now, we have one program in Bangladesh that fulfills our requirement, and we are still, that is not the most efficient way to generate the funds necessary to support those development programs.
Well, I understand the requirements, and I understand the third parties' needs for funds, and this is one of the ways they can get funds. But I think you've answered my question. This is not the most efficient way to be able to get resources to deal with the problem.
This is not the most efficient way to do that, yes, and I believe that I am hopeful that as we go forward that we can develop new ways or more efficient ways to provide that necessary aspect to support development.
I'm going to use your remaining 39 seconds to embellish and just say, look, we in our own country have issues with China dumping steel or dumping panels or whatever. I mean, it's a big issue to us. With our program, where we'd like for USAID to help countries be self-sustainable, right? I mean, that's our goal, is that over time these countries, through our programs, we take our commodities, ship them overseas, lose 75 cents on the dollar, and then sell them sub-market prices in the market and destabilize the very farmers in those areas that we're hoping over time are going to build the capacity to feed their own people. It's a most idiotic requirement one could possibly come up with. And again, the entire program is 0.1% of what our whole U.S. ag output is, meaning it has no effect on our agriculture community. So anyway, thank you.
Reserving my 7 seconds. You're absolutely right. If we appropriated the money so that they had the money, this is done, I think, yes, because of the local agricultural interests, but also supported by the third-party groups because it's a source of funds they otherwise couldn't get.
Yeah. No, we would need to make sure this is appropriated in another part and allow you and others to carry this out, and I agree with that 100%. And it's really an issue of staffers ag staffers, let's face it,
Yeah.
keeping, keeping under their wing additional dollars, okay, that the ag community doesn't even want them to keep. But anyway, Senator Young.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Nims, good to see you again. You testified before my subcommittee on July 18, and I was grateful for that. And I'd like to follow up with you and request an update on the situation in Yemen, specifically the humanitarian crisis there and the number of people who are food insecure and subject to the cholera epidemic. Could you kindly provide a quick summary of that?
Thank you, Senator, for your question. Yes, Yemen still represents one of the largest probably humanitarian crisis that we have in terms of numbers. An estimated 17 million people out of a population of 27 million are food insecure at this time. 7 million of those completely dependent upon humanitarian assistance for their survival at this time. Since last time we spoke, the cholera epidemic continues. We have over 770 documented cases from the World Health Organization, with over 2,000 deaths, mostly in elderly and children.
Yeah, but where's in our subcommittee hearing, you identified the port of Hodeidah as the most critical port of entry for humanitarian supplies to help mitigate and alleviate some of the suffering that's occurring in that country. Can you explain the importance of that port to relief efforts and how the delivery of USAID-funded cranes would facilitate delivery of food and medicine through the port?
So I definitely affirm that the port of Hodeidah is the principal lifeline for humanitarian operations as well as commercial activities. Yemen is dependent upon 90% exports to receive its food. So it is crucial in how this goes forward. You are correct that USAID did sponsor and fund the purchase of 4 cranes on behalf of the World Food Program to improve port operations. Those cranes remain in Saudi Arabia in a warehouse there. They were denied entry by the coalition of forces at this time. USAID maintains that the addition to these cranes to port operations would greatly improve the throughput of that port to allow additional humanitarian as well as commercial cargo to more quickly throughput through the port and have an impact on the situation.
You mentioned Saudi Arabia. I think you meant to say that the cranes were in Dubai right now. But since you mentioned Saudi Arabia, I'll move on to that. On June 27, the World Food Program sent a letter to the Saudi government asking for permission to try and deliver the cranes, which were turned back by the Saudi-led coalition some time ago. And the content of that letter was, again, seeking permission to deliver those cranes to the port of Hodeidah to expedite the delivery of this much-needed humanitarian assistance. The argument we keep hearing, which is consistently met with a compelling and persuasive counter-argument, is that there is a large-scale diversion of humanitarian aid to Hodeidah. And in July, you said what other experts are saying. You said, quote, "We've had no evidence of any large-scale or systematic humanitarian diversions occurring at the port at all," unquote. Is that still accurate?
Yes.
And would you say the humanitarian access and the flow of humanitarian aid into Yemen continues to be a leading challenge, sir?
Yes.
Okay. Well, the participants in the conflict are seeking to control access to the beneficiary communities. It's something you've gone on record saying here today and before. Before you've indicated it's a tool for advancing their cause. I want to put that in layman's terms to make clear what you've indicated. Have you said, and are you saying today, that the participants to the conflict in Yemen are deliberately restricting food or medicine to the vulnerable populations to advance their aims?
Yes. Well, yes.
Are those political aims?
Yes.
Are those war aims?
Yes.
In USAID's assessment or your assessment, are those participants included within that? Would that be the Saudi-led coalition?
The
Seems like a logical connection to what you
the teams on the ground
earlier said and what you just said.
Yes, that both sides are responsible for that situation.
So it is your assessment that it includes the Saudi-led coalition?
Correct.
All right, thank you. So to be clear and to add some clarity to our discussions related to Yemen, Mr. Nims, you just testified saying essentially the Saudi-led coalition is using food as a weapon of war in Yemen. The Houthis are a large part of the problem, no doubt. But I, for one, believe we should use our partnership with the Saudis to bring this unacceptable practice to an end without delay. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. You've mastered in this subject, no doubt. We appreciate it very much. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Corker, Ranking Member Cardin, and thank you for this important hearing on an intolerable situation that is a requirement in statute that you, Mr. Nims, and many other dedicated professionals do your absolute best to execute on. I'm grateful for your service and for the fact that we as a generous nation continue to try and meet the unbelievable challenge of 20 million people starving or at risk of starving across just 4 countries, and millions more, you said about 800 million globally, going to bed hungry every night. The American people are generous. We have the most productive farms in the world. And so for decades, we have had a program that gives of our abundance to those who are in need around the world, but we do so in a strikingly inefficient way. I was proud to have a chance to work with my good friend Senator Isaacson and the chair and ranking and many others on the Global Food Security Act, which permanently authorized the Emergency Food Security Program, an important step in providing flexibility for delivering emergency food aid. And as Senator Cardin reminded all of us, there will always be a role for U.S. commodities in response to crises, but we can and should work together to find ways in advance of this coming Farm Bill to remove some of these harmful restrictions and requirements that I think are so inefficient. Earlier this year, Senator Corker and I visited the Bidi camp in northern Uganda. I was grateful for your joining us on that trip, and both there and in South Sudan, I had a chance to visit sites where people depend on food aid for their existence. And later in August, I traveled to northeast Nigeria, where millions have been internally displaced, mostly by Boko Haram. I was struck by an innovative program that this is an example from Save the Children, but I suspect is well known to you. When we talk about a cash assistance program, we're not talking about sending out envelopes full of cash. We're talking about this. This is a card from a real specific individual in an IDP camp that allows her to go out and buy locally food that is appropriate for her and her children, and that changes the relationship between this refugee camp and the community around it. It provides for stability in the local markets. It provides for a better relationship between the refugee community and the community that is hosting them, and it gives more control for individuals for how they feed their children. And it frankly is much more traceable, transparent, and efficient. So I'd like to ask you a little bit more, if I could, about these so-called cash or voucher assistance programs, because I think they are dramatically more efficient than the average person might realize. When I first heard about changing from sending shiploads of American grain to sending cash, I thought, well, that's not a very good idea. It turns out that's not at all what we're doing. We're mostly doing it through very sophisticated means, whether through cell phones or individual EBT cards or with retinal scans, so that we actually have a very good idea who's getting what money to what purpose. Could you first speak to how USAID's experience with local and regional procurement has worked out so far? And what are the benefits and the difficulties to some of these innovative, I need a better word than cash, some of these innovative direct transfer food programs, and how they help you respond to these food crises?
Thank you for that question. And thank you for, again, inviting me on that trip. What we are now calling these programs is market-based assistance, which means that our teams on the ground work very hard to understand the market conditions. And to be clear, there are some places in the world where there are no market and where there are crises exist, and where in-kind food assistance can still play a role. On the local procurement side, we work very hard with our partners to identify those areas, those markets that exist, whether inside a country or in a region in different markets of Africa, where we can buy the needed commodity that it does not exist in a place where we need to go in a different location, have our partners the ability to buy this, adhering to the same sort of rules and governance of procurement that we would use in the United States to ensure that we get the right quality of food and a good quality of food. By doing that, the time saved is huge because the ocean leg is not there. Combined with the market impacts, just as you said, in the community of where we're working. What we have developed over the years is just to ensure that we are not having a negative impact, that we are increasing prices, or that we're buying the wrong commodity, or that we are somehow contributing to an existing crisis that might be there. That takes really a lot of expertise of our partners, like the Catholic Relief Services, as well as the World Food Program, to ensure that's happening. So in the local procurement, it has saved us both time and money and become more effective as an agency in addressing these concerns. On the other programs, the voucher programs that you admit, or the programs that allow a family member or a family at large to go to a local market or a grocery store, has developed a whole new industry, or helped to develop the industry in these retinal scans or in these cards or in this mobile money, to ensure that the person targeted, the person that is supposed to receive the aid, does receive that. And we have put in place methods to ensure that those are the right people that are receiving the assistance. And as you said, they afford us the ability to know what the group of people are buying, to ensure that when we give money that we are having a nutritional or a food security impact, and that they aren't using these funds and prohibited it in most cases, and using these funds for other commodities that don't have a food security impact. So that we always want to ensure that we are targeting those most food insecure and that we are having impact.
Could I ask one more question, Mr.
Sure.
The chairman and others, the ranking, we've spoken about the damage, the danger of monetization. I understand the benefit to the NGOs, but the inefficiency is just stunning. What are the negative impacts on the ground in terms of instability in local markets and resiliency of the practice of monetization? Shipping U.S. commodities to remote parts of the world so they can be resold there.
At a 75 cent on the dollar loss.
I want to actually take this opportunity to correct that number. It was a 25 cent loss on the dollar. I got my numbers backwards, so I want to enter in the record that it's a 25 cent loss on the dollar. Thank you for that question as well. Monetization has been around for a long time, and there are rules that govern how we do monetization. Primarily, it's the Bellman determination, which ensures when we go into a country that we do look at the global market or the universal market in that country to ensure that the tonnage that we bring in has a very small to no impact on the market. And we take that very seriously with our colleagues at the Department of Agriculture, and we have done that for quite some time. So to answer your question, very minimal detrimental impact on the market of a given country is what we strive to do, because that's what we have been doing. For USAID and for my Office for Food for Peace, the biggest detriment is that we lose 25 cents on the dollar. And it does require that our partners who sell this food have to develop ways to be able to sell this food. NGOs traditionally are not commodity brokers, and it takes a specialized skill to do this effectively. And that takes a lot of time and effort that could be better spent on running programs as opposed to being commodity brokers.
Well, thank you, Mr. Nims. I think we have a shared question about how we sustain U.S. food assistance while working together to make it more efficient, given the scale and scope of the humanitarian need around the world. Thank you for the very hard work you and your folks do to meet this massive humanitarian need.
Senator Isaacson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize, Mr. Mims, for being late. I'm sorry I missed your testimony. My biggest experience in food aid happened a few years ago when a small company in Georgia by the name of Manna, and you probably are familiar with Manna,
Yes, sir.
which produces a 3.5-ounce fortified peanut butter paste in a heat seal packet in huge volume, and it's the way you can actually keep children and adults alive and avoid malnutrition for a sustained period of time. It's a great, the peanut is, I'm not selling for my state here, but I might as well. The peanut is a great product, and it tastes good on top of everything else. But I got in the middle of trying to help them and found out that there's a lot of politics and brokerage going on, and whose food gets sent overseas and where it goes and who takes it, everything else. In particular, in terms of nutrition, there was a French company that really had cornered the market, in sustaining packets of vitamin-fortified foods to get to starved areas. In this case, it was, if I remember correctly, it was Somalia. Is there still a lot of politics, and are there still a lot of companies that try and corner the market in that, or how competitive is from the standpoint of lowering the cost of price and maximizing the amount of food you can get overseas?
Senator, thank you for that question. USAID, in particular, my Office Food for Peace, are incredibly proud of the ready-to-use therapeutic and ready-to-use supplementary food that you mentioned, both from MANA and 2 other companies here in the United States, that being Tabachnik Corporation as well as Adhesia. And we see this as a huge success, that we have been able to work with these companies, with U.S. companies, to develop this incredibly crucial commodity that exists to save babies, to save starving children. And we have utilized that effectively over the last 4 years and increased our purchase of that product. In answer to your question, are there still politics involved? Unfortunately, there are politics involved in everything, but on this particular issue, sir, we no longer have any restrictions on where we can program that food, and our partners have accepted the fact that regardless of the source, they can use that where needed. We see that the price over time has become very competitive in the world market, and we look at continuing to use this product because of the success.
USAID, I know, is where you're under USAID. Does USDA also provide food for overseas use?
Yes, they do.
Do you work with them, or is that a separate function they carry out?
We work very closely with them. Elements of USDA purchase all of our commodity. They're our contractors in a sense. They purchase that, and we work closely with the McGovern-Dole food program, the school feeding program, as well as the Food for Progress, most assuredly on the local level to ensure that our programs are working together.
So USDA determines how those commodities are actually sourced. Mm-hmm. Is that correct? Whether you use domestics program?
Correct. They are our contractor. In this particular case of these specialized nutrition products, USAID Food for Peace, we purchase those directly ourselves.
And where do you get those? Is there any incentive to try and buy those foods in countries that are developing nations that are beginning a food program to help reinforce what they're trying to do?
We would be using our international disaster assistance funds to do that, and there are cases if there are companies or facilities overseas outside of Europe that are able to produce a product that meets the requirements of, let's say, the United Nations, UNICEF, or some of our partners, we would look to purchase locally those products as well. There are at least 3, I believe, plants in Africa that can produce a comparable product, and we have purchased those, our partners have purchased those using international disaster assistance funds in our programs.
That's exactly the genesis of my question, because I've traveled with Senator Coons and others to Africa quite a bit, and Africa, many of those countries are now developing an sustainable agricultural program in their country. It would seem like everything we could do to reinforce that by buying their product to help use to keep other people from going hungry would be just a 2-for-1 win for us and for USAID and for the country.
I agree, sir.
Thank you very much for what you do. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Nims, both for being here today and for the hard work that you do to make sure people get fed in this world. You referred in your testimony to the amount of money that has been appropriated to help address 4 famines that are going on right now. Can you be a little more specific about how much of that money's been dispersed, how it's being used, what the progress and roadblocks that we're experiencing in the distribution of food that is being bought by those dollars? And just to follow up on Senator Young's comments, clearly we're having a problem in Yemen with trying to get help to people who need it. So can you talk more specifically about what's going on?
Thank you for that question. I will attempt to answer that the best I can, and please, if there's something I leave out. I think that first off, just to thank Congress writ large for the incredible amount of financial support that Food for Peace received in 2017. As we've all said, there was unprecedented need in the world, and I can say that for a fact. Our partners on the ground have not seen We thought El Nino was bad in 2016. 2017 is unprecedented need in all sense of the word. Not, it is a scientific word in a sense. We have not seen this. And Congress...
And am I correct? There was just a report this week that talked about the direction of number of people who are food insecure is going up for the first time in a number of years.
You are absolutely correct, Senator. In the report that just came out, State of the World on Food Insecurity, that said in the first year and over past 10 years, malnutrition has increased. So in other words, we have been, as a world community, decreasing food insecurity around the world. This year, that number has gone back the other way. This is the beginning of a very unfortunate and deleterious trend. The report further says that the majority of this is due to the amount of conflict in the world. So I want to be clear, this is not because of international development efforts. This is not because we as a world community are trying to address food insecurity to increase food. As the opening statement, there is enough food being produced in the world to feed the hungry people. In this sense, it is a direct cause of the conflicts, the growing conflicts that are existing in the world that is really causing that.
And those 4 areas where we're seeing famine are cases in point.
Most directly, as well as the Democratic Republic of the Congo is now entering into this stage. Elements still in parts of the Horn of Africa continue to be plagued by conflict that cause this problem, yes. In response to your question, $990 million was a supplemental that Congress added directly towards this combating famine. All of that $990 million was spent in all of those 4 primary countries, both in the form of IDA, of International Disaster Assistance, and $300 million of that was actually converted into Title II, and that was also utilized. So we can say that the $990 million was all spent this year into the 4 countries, and it came towards the end of the year, end of the fiscal year, where we really started getting that out the door, both ordering large volumes as well as making sure that our primary partners in those operations received funding, and it has been expended. We are carrying forward money from 2017 into 2018, which is not an abnormal occurrence, and we'll be carrying forward, we're still actually closing the books, but we'll be carrying forward both Title II in-kind resources as well as IDA resources that we share with our sister office, so the Office of the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, OFDA, at USAID.
And are the cranes that Senator Young referred to, were they purchased out of those dollars?
They were purchased actually in 2016, if I'm correct, and those were not part of the 2017 funds, and they were purchased using international disaster assistance funds, yes.
And can you talk about who are the next countries that are working in those 4 areas that have provided funding to try and address the crisis?
We can get back to you on the exact levels and assistance as we understand it at this time. In each one of in those places, the highest donors maybe differ a little bit between the countries, but maintain. It's the European Union, what we call ECHO. In other words, their group. The British government, the United Kingdom, is usually in the top 1 or 2. Syria right now, the Germans have been very good partners as well. But in all cases, the U.S. government is the largest donor.
And Mr. Chairman, if I could ask one more question. Are either Saudi Arabia or any of the Gulf countries providing humanitarian assistance in Yemen to address the crisis there that we know of?
They are not providing assistance through the UN or other international NGOs that we have been able to track. We have heard the Saudi Arabian government say that they are providing assistance, but we have not been, it is not through the traditional ways that we have been able to see.
And do we have any evidence on the ground that there is assistance being provided by Saudi Arabia?
USAID does not have evidence at this time. I am unaware if our partners, maybe certain NGOs or the UN, have direct evidence of this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Markley.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Nims. Right now, we have a horrific crisis with the ethnic cleansing in Burma and 500,000 refugees passing across the border into Bangladesh. Enormous number of people. The flow continues. I think 20,000 in the last a week or two, another 20,000. So use this as an example of how a crisis is developing, how you respond currently, and how you could respond more effectively.
Thank you for that question. What we've seen, to put it in context, we've seen actually numbers now are 600,000 to almost 700,000 Rohingyas from Myanmar, from Burma, have fled to Bangladesh. Just to put this in perspective, when we went to Bidi Bidi camp, in over about a 5 to 6 month period, we saw upwards of 250,000 people that crossed the border from South Sudan into Uganda. What we are seeing in Bangladesh is in a 3 to 4 week period, close to 600,000 to 700,000 people crossing over into an area, a very small area. So just to put that in context, we are at the beginnings of a very huge humanitarian crisis.
So there it is. Your team is in this business of responding. What is it you're doing? And tell us how changes in the obstacles you face could enable you to be more effective, get there more quickly, get there with more assistance, different types of food assistance that's appropriate. What's happening in the kind of the short version, and how could you have been more effective if we changed some rules or regulations?
So thus far, Food for Peace is primarily charged when people cross a border to feed the refugees with our partners. We work in very good coordination with the State Department's Office of Population, Refugees, and Migration. And they take the leading role in far as helping to set up the actual camps through their partners, whether it be UNHCR or whether that be the International Office of Migration. And I can say that thus far, PRM and Food for Peace on the ground have been intimately involved in what's going on and have worked diligently together to start the process.
Here's what I'm looking for. How many ships do you have? Where's the food coming from? Is it pre-positioned? Do you have planes in the air? Are you requesting cargo planes? Are there obstacles that you've run into so people are going to starve before we can get there effectively? I'm happy everybody's working together. What's happening and how could it be improved?
In this case, because we have a relatively large operation development program, we've been able to use our development resources and our partners to ensure that food has arrived there. We are well stead through our partners to buy locally through the IDA funds to ensure that we have food there and ready to go. Because of the remoteness, it is a difficult area. We've also had to improve the logistics, meaning roads, even construction, to ensure our partners get there. So what could we do? The increased flexibility allows our office to do what's needed, whether that is shipping in more quickly, the foods that the Senator Isaacson talked about the ready-to-use therapeutic foods. We are all able to do that with the funds that we have now, and we are doing that. But in these type of dynamic situations, having flexibility to do this, to be able to respond to the changing needs of this over such a fast time, will give us better ability to handle this effectively. So I would say that we are well stead right now to do the needful, and we have been as we look forward to as this crisis develops. The increased flexibility that we have or that we can have will enable us to ensure that we are meeting the needs.
Okay, well, that's very vague. I might want to follow up with you. Do you have a command center? If I walked in, do you have a command center where you have key experts on all the logistics and you're saying, hey, we need bulldozers to get a road in there, we need gravel, how are we going to do that? Well, can we really buy locally? No, because everyone in that area is already starving. So how does that change it? What do we have pre-positioned? Where is it at? How can we requisition it? How is it impacted by what's needed for Puerto Rico? Do you have a command center like that to respond to these world emergencies?
We do not have a command center here in the U.S. right now to respond to that. We do have our people on the ground. U.S. Food for Peace has sent 2 additional staff to augment the mission team that is there, the USAID mission team. PRM has also sent additional staff to the area. That type of coordination is happening on the ground right now.
Thank you.
Okay. If I could, the quick response that you've been able to have here is because you're using the IDA funds that we gave you the flexibility to use. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And if you were using U.S. commodities to get there, it might take 4 to 6 months to even get the food there in the first place. Is that correct?
Yes. In that sense, though, as I said, we do have development partners there, so we would be using some of their food, but you're exactly correct.
So it's kind of the point of the hearing. So just the flexibilities that we have given him have allowed him to more fully respond to this. If we could do even more of that, more people could be helped. We thank you very much for your service. And it's a shame, by the way, we don't have a leader in Burma that cares about the Rohingyas in the first place, that could keep the military from doing what they're doing to route these people across the border. And I hope she will be demarched by every world leader on the face of this earth for her insensitive handling of what's happening there. So it's something that she herself is helping create. With that, thank you so much for your testimony and your service to our country. We're going to move to the next panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator.
Yes, sir. Good to see you, sir. Always good to see you guys. Thanks for everything. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Well, that'll teach me. That'll teach me to show up late. Oh, but
Hey,
there's a second. Is there a second
another panel.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
I want to thank Mr. Nims again for his outstanding testimony and service to our country, and we will now move to our second panel. There are be some votes. We apologize that are being taken. Let me apologize in advance. We're going to have some people disappearing because of votes, but this testimony will be very important as it relates to us moving ahead. Our first witness is Mr. Tom Melito, Director of International Affairs and Trade at the Government Accountability Office, GAO. Our second witness is Mr. Christopher Barrett. Spent some time with him this morning. Professor of Economics and Agriculture at Cornell University. He's done some outstanding work on this topic. Our third witness is Mr. Bill O'Keefe, who was referred to earlier, Vice President for Government Relations and Advocacy at the Catholic Relief Services. We thank you for what you and your organization does in this regard. With that, if each of you could summarize in about 5 minutes. If you have any written materials you want entered into the record without objection, it will be. And if you could just begin in the order of introduction, we'd appreciate it. Thank you all for your tremendous efforts. Thank you.
Chairman Corker, Ranking Member Cardin, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss our 2015 report on cargo preference for food aid. The United States shipped about 1.5 million metric tons of food aid in fiscal year 2015. Under current U.S. law, at least 50% of U.S. food aid must be shipped on U.S. flag vessels, which was reduced from 75% in 2012. USAID and USDA administer food aid programs. The Department of Transportation, DOT, is responsible for monitoring USAID and USDA's adherence to cargo preference requirements. My remarks today address 3 topics. First, cargo preference's impact on food aid. Second, the extent to which cargo preference contributes to sea lift capacity. And third, GAO's recommendations. Regarding the first topic, we found that cargo preference increased the cost of shipping food aid for USAID and USDA by $107 million from April 2011 through September 2014. Foreign flag vessels charged, on average, 25% less for shipping than U.S. flag vessels. According to DOT, this difference is due to several factors, including higher crew, maintenance, and overhead costs. We also found that USDA paid higher shipping rates and used fewer foreign flag vessels than USAID because of differing applications of cargo preference requirements between the two agencies. According to the law, compliance with cargo preference is tracked by geographic area, but this term is not defined. Pursuant to a court order, USDA must measure compliance on a country-by-country basis, forcing them to use only U.S. flag vessels to countries where there's just one shipment a year. This prevented USDA from realizing much benefit from the lowering of the cargo preference rate. However, USAID benefited considerably more since it is not bound by the court order, defining geographic area on a global basis for its packaged food and regionally for bulk food aid. Regarding the second topic, cargo preferences contribution to sea lift capacity, we found that the number of vessels carrying food aid and U.S. mariners required to crew them has steadily declined despite the application of cargo preference. From 2005 to 2014, the number of U.S. flag vessels carrying food aid declined from 89 to 38, and the number of mariners crewing them fell from about 1,300 positions to approximately 600. According to Department of Defense officials, available vessel and mariner capacity has historically been sufficient to meet all of Defense's needs. However, Defense's most serious scenario envisions a full activation of the entire reserve fleet for an extended period of time, including the use of some commercial sea lift. Under this extreme scenario, DOT estimated that about 13,000 mariners are required to support both military and commercial needs. While the Coast Guard database showed over 16,000 potentially qualified, actively sailing mariners, DOT stated that only about 11,000 mariners would be readily available. However, Transportation's estimate did not include the almost 2,000 officers in the Strategic Sea Lift Officer Program, of whom over 1,000 were not actively sailing and could potentially be called up. We requested that DOT provide us the detailed methodology underlying its estimate. However, DOT did not provide the methodology to us. For the third topic, GEO's recommendations, we had one matter for congressional consideration and one recommendation to the Secretary of Transportation. Regarding the matter for congressional consideration, despite two past GEO recommendations, U.S. agencies have not agreed on a consistent method to implement cargo preference based on geographic area. As such, Congress should consider clarifying cargo preference legislation regarding the definition of geographic area to ensure that agencies can fully utilize the flexibility Congress granted them when it lowered the cargo preference requirements in 2012. GEO also recommended that the Secretary of Transportation study the potential availability of all qualified mariners needed to meet a full and prolonged activation of the reserve sea lift fleet. In its written comments, DOT concurred with our recommendation, but it remains unimplemented. In September 2016, DOT tested mariner availability for an initial activation of the full fleet. However, this exercise did not gauge mariner availability on the Defense's most severe scenario, where DOT had previously projected a shortage of available mariners. Chairman Corker, Ranking Member Cardin, and members of the committee, this completes my prepared statement. I will please respond to any questions you may have.
Thank you so much. Dr. Barrett.
Chairman Corker, Ranking Member Cardin, honorable senators, thank you for the opportunity to summarize what the best recent research tells us about food aid policies and how we might more effectively use those resources to address global food insecurity. U.S. food aid programs have played a crucial role in saving and improving lives worldwide for more than 200 years. Sadly, the need for international food assistance is growing. For the first time ever, in 2017, the United Nations declared 4 nations in famine or near famine conditions and proclaimed it the largest humanitarian crisis since the UN's creation in 1945. But budgetary resources have shrunk by 76% in inflation-adjusted terms since the 1960s. As a result, the agencies that provide frontline humanitarian assistance are chronically underfunded. With food aid funding scarcer and needs greater, we must get smarter in how we use these resources. Congress should make 2 reforms in particular to enhance the cost-effective use of increasingly scarce food aid resources. First, relax or better eliminate the cargo preference restrictions, and 2, relax the restrictions that compel commodity purchase only in the United States. Anti-competitive cargo preference predictably drives up costs by an estimated 23 to 46%, depending upon whose estimates you use, costing us anywhere from $50 to $150 million a year, depending upon prevailing rates. Meanwhile, cargo preference does little to nothing to buttress military readiness beyond what is already provided for by the separately funded Maritime Security Program, MSP. Most U.S. flag cargo preference vessels are not militarily useful by DoD criteria because of their age, size, or vessel type. In 60-plus years under cargo preference, the Pentagon has never mobilized a mariner or vessel from the non-MSP cargo preference fleet. Nor does cargo preference preserve an American fleet. The daily operating costs of U.S. flagships average 270% more than comparable foreign vessels, partly because of the fact that they're typically slower, smaller, and older than their competitors. Cargo preference also generates negligible gains for port regions or the maritime workforce because food aid represents less than 0.3% of merchandise exports from the United States. And even in those ports that handle food aid shipments, it is less than 1% of their merchandise export volumes. Cargo preference matters only for a very small number of owners of bulk and break bulk ships with limited alternative commercial uses. In 2016, just 13 vessels from only 3 companies accounted for more than 83% of the U.S. food aid shipments from this country. That sort of concentration would excite antitrust concerns in most sectors of the economy. Furthermore, many cargo preference vessels are ultimately owned by foreign corporations. So the profiteers from the anti-competitive statutory restrictions on U.S. food aid are not even American companies. The second major restriction that Congress should relax compels domestic procurement of all food for peace commodities. The most efficient and effective means to meet the needs of hungry people is typically to provide them with vouchers or cash-based electronic transfers, or with food purchased locally or regionally, so-called LRP. Far more often than not, LRP and cash or electronic transfers save time, money, and lives while providing foods that are equally healthy and safe and preferred by recipients over commodities shipped from the United States. The U.S. government has experience with such modalities, especially through the Emergency Food Security Program codified in law as part of the Global Food Security Act of 2016, led by this committee, for which I applaud all of you. Their experience clearly demonstrates that these more flexible methods typically outperform in-kind food aid. Some claim that food aid purchased in the U.S. somehow helps American farmers. No credible study exists to support such a claim. U.S. food aid programs handle hundreds of millions of dollars worth of commodities, but the U.S. agricultural market is several $100 billion and is tightly integrated into a $4 trillion global agricultural economy. Farm prices and incomes are driven by global markets. They're not driven at all by the U.S. food aid program. These and other restrictions on U.S. food aid have real consequences. American taxpayers spend far more on shipping and handling than on food. Every tax dollar spent on U.S. food aid yields only 35 to 40 cents of commodity to hungry people. And the human cost is stark, because saving lives in disasters is actually relatively cheap. The $300 to $400 million wasted on these various restrictions effectively costs us something like 40,000 children's lives every year. And what is the Congress buying for an extra 40,000 child deaths annually? Tragically, very little. The volumes of food aid purchased in and shipped from the U.S., a fraction of 1% of the domestic food market, of the ocean freight cargo from U.S. ports, of militarily useful vessels, and of deep water maritime workforce, is far too small to boost farmers' incomes or mariners' incomes noticeably, or to enhance military readiness. So what should the Congress do? Eliminate these restrictions. Give the Secretary of Agriculture and the AID administrator the flexibility to employ best practice. Distinguished senators, you have a choice. We can maintain the status quo and thereby keep diverting U.S. taxpayer money from hungry people to foreign companies, accomplishing nothing significant for military readiness or Americans' incomes while costing the lives of disaster-affected children, or we can make changes that can help us better serve the world's hungry and honor this great nation's long heritage of humanitarian leadership by providing cost-effective assistance to the downtrodden throughout the world. Thank you very much for your time and interest.
Thank you for that outstanding testimony, Mr. O'Keefe.
Thank you, Chairman Corker, Ranking Member Cardin, and members of the committee for this opportunity to provide testimony on modernizing the Food for Peace program. The Food for Peace program and the committed staff of the Office of Food for Peace has been a mainstay of the American response to hunger for over 60 years, and it reflects the generosity of the American people. Since its founding, Food for Peace has only gotten better, and today is a dynamic program effectively delivering a hand up to people and communities otherwise left out of foreign assistance. In natural and conflict emergencies, Food for Peace provides life-saving food to millions of people. In vulnerable communities experiencing chronic hunger, its development programs build resilience and prevent people from falling into desperation. Last year, Eastern and Southern Africa were hit by the most severe El Nino drought in a generation, but an anticipated famine in Ethiopia never materialized because Food for Peace, partnering with other U.S. and international entities, Catholic Relief Services, and other groups, had built the resilience of communities in drought-prone areas and expanded emergency assistance to those who needed it. Similarly, in Malawi, while neighboring communities needed emergency food aid, those who had participated in a development program that had ended 2 years prior were able to provide for themselves without emergency help. On behalf of these and others we serve, I want to thank Congress for supporting this program, especially by reversing the draconian cut proposed in the FY 2018 budget request. With unprecedented human need, we must both improve and expand Food for Peace and other foreign assistance programs. My written testimony provides 5 specific suggestions for Food for Peace. First, eliminate the monetization requirement for development Food for Peace programs. Second, authorize the Community Development Fund mechanism, which replaces monetization to a significant extent and supplements the 202E cash funding that the 2014 Farm Bill increased. Third, streamline regulations and reporting for Food for Peace and the Emergency Food Security Program for more seamless responses. Fourth, elevate past performance as a critical factor in determining winning bids for ocean freight contracts for any in-kind food shipped. And finally, eliminate the cargo preference requirement on all food aid programs. I'll focus the rest of my remarks on cargo preference briefly. Catholic Relief Services is a major implementer of U.S. food aid programs, including the Food for Peace program managed by USAID and the McGovern-Dole Food for Education and Food for Progress programs managed by USDA. Due to the cargo preference requirement, at least 50% of the food aid shipped via ocean freight for these programs must be on U.S. flagged vessels. We reviewed the shipping history for CRS food-assisted programs in the fiscal years FY 2013, 2014, 2015. We literally went through all the bills of lading and conducted analysis, and we learned that CRS programs during that time period accounted for about 10% of all the food shipped for USDA and USAID. And we discovered that over the period, U.S. flag carriers were 18 to 51% more expensive per metric ton than foreign flag carriers in the USAID programs, varies a little bit year by year. And U.S. flag carriers were 80 to 162% more per metric ton than foreign flag carriers for USDA programs. If U.S. flag carriers had matched the average foreign flag rate in each of these years, we would have spent $23.8 million less in shipping during this 3-year period, and we did a little back of the envelope map, and we think that comes out to about 500,000 additional emergency food aid recipients who we could have helped. Annual congressional appropriations pay for shipping, whether U.S. or foreign flag, as part of our nation's response to hunger and poverty around the world. Extra money spent on shipping is money not spent feeding hungry people. I'm not qualified to judge whether the cargo preference requirement achieves the necessary national security objective of maintaining sea lift or the laudable goal of providing jobs tied to that capacity. However, we at Catholic Relief Services deeply appreciate the service and sacrifice of mariners who have helped deliver food aid for the last 60 years. We welcome their contribution in ways that do not reduce the program's ability to assist as many people as possible. Surely there are other ways of supporting the mariners and maintaining our nation's sea lift capacity without indirectly penalizing vulnerable and hungry people. Short of eliminating the cargo preference requirement, we do have some specific recommendations that could be considered to reduce its unintended negative consequences. I'd be happy to discuss these or any other issues of interest to the committee. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
That is some of the best testimony we've had before our committee, and I rest my case with the three of you testifying. So I'm going to defer my questioning time to Senator Cardin, who is going to defer his time to Senator Kaine, who showed up late as usual. The late as usual part is a joke. But
I want to agree with our chairman. I thought that your testimonies were very specific, and we appreciate that very much. I might have a few questions for the record, but we're going to be tight on time, so I would give Senator Kaine an opportunity to question.
I appreciate my chair. I used to have a history professor. If you'd come in late, he'd say a diller, a dollar, a 10 o'clock scholar. So I was a 10 o'clock scholar coming in late for panel 2, but good testimony. I want to direct my questions to Mr. O'Keefe. In your experiences in working with the Food for Peace program, I would love to hear your view, kind of assessment of potential aspects of in-kind food aid relative to the benefits of the cash-based assistance. So, you know, we have been in pursuing a different direction, and now a couple of years into that, if you could share your perspectives on, are we balancing it right now, that would be helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you, Senator. So in our assessment, cash is a very important tool to have in our toolbox, and we deeply have appreciated the additional flexibility that the program has granted and the EFSP program authorized by this committee as part of the Global Food Security Act. We still need in-kind food aid in very specific situations. In Ethiopia, for example, where the need is huge, in-kind food aid is critical. In South Sudan, where I was 2 years ago visiting and saw the dysfunction of markets, the overall lack of food available, and the unbelievable need, we need to bring in food assistance from outside. In terms of cash assistance, over the last year, CRS is providing $77 million of cash market-based assistance of the type we have been discussing in this hearing. That's doubled since FY16, and we anticipate it will continue to grow. Senator Coons, your example from northern Nigeria of the SAVE program is an excellent one, similar to one we are also doing there. I see you can get lunch with that probably somewhere, but we are... The one thing I wanted to add to that is in that conflict situation where we are able to track and monitor the food distributions through this market-based system, through, in other words, cash on a card that's used to buy food in a store, we can monitor through the internet who is buying at what store in real time, when in places where we can't actually go safely. So it allows us to extend further than we might normally be able to do because of just serious security situations. So the balance, I think, is getting better, certainly, and cash is a critical tool in our toolbox.
And do you think the balance is getting better and that, you know, in the USAID family, regional leaders have the tools they need to decide how to adjust that balance to, you know, properly account for what's going to be best in any circumstance?
I think that there are still situations where the right tool is not always available at the right time. And but I don't have an aggregate sense worldwide of whether, of kind of what's holding that up. I can say for us at Catholic Relief Services, having the ability to make context-specific recommendations based on the market and the people who we are assessing is absolutely critical, which is why we've been advocating for increased flexibility.
Could I ask my other two witnesses whether you have any significant difference of opinion with what Mr. O'Keefe has said about sort of this balance between cash and direct food aid?
Senator, no, I completely agree. Things have changed dramatically over the past 15, 20 years. While I've studied U.S. food aid programs, especially thanks to EFSP, there's considerably greater flexibility afforded to humanitarian agencies, and they're using it quite well. And I applaud USAID. They labor extremely well against the constraints imposed by present statutes, but those are binding constraints. They really slow delivery and they cost money. Groups are being very efficient and creative, but we could do better.
Mr. Melito.
GAO has consistently called on AID to make sure they have the underlying market conditions assessed correctly and then choose the right modality for it. Cash is often the right option, but sometimes because of droughts and conflict, it's actually bringing in commodities. And then the commodities can be brought in either from the U.S. or locally, regionally. But the key is to know the underlying problem first. The problem is if you actually provide cash in a situation where there's a shortage of food, you could create inflation, in which case you drive more people into hunger.
The last question I'll ask with 30 seconds left is, are we doing enough through USAID, our NGO community, to promote the growth of the agricultural sector of economies that are hard hit? I mean, obviously, I see a real correlation between strong agriculture and reduction in hunger, and that's an important question that USAID and other agencies can address. Are we doing enough there?
We can certainly do more, but let me just say the addition of the CRS has a build, grow, a sort of recover, build, grow view of agriculture, where we are helping people to move up the market chain of involvement. And the U.S. government now has placed the Food for Peace Development Program, which helps the poor communities, farmers to become market ready, and then the Feed the Future program, which helps those who are already beginning to participate in the market to engage and earn more income and then become fully self-sufficient and leaders in their community. Having all those tools in place is very important. They're not mutually exclusive. They don't overlap completely, and we need the Food for Peace Development Program as a key part of our agricultural strategy. The resources are never enough. They are not enough, and I think we could all agree to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Senator Young.
Well, thank you, Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member, for holding this important hearing. I'd like to direct my questions to you, Mr. Melito. I'm so appreciative of GAO and all the important reports you produce, and more importantly, the recommendations you make to various agencies. And as of yesterday, Department of State had 119 open recommendations, 20 of which were priority recommendations that are still open. And USAID had 42 open recommendations, 11 of which are priority. 20 of those recommendations relate directly to food assistance, and 5 of those are priority. So it's really important to my mind that these recommendations are addressed on account of efficiency and effectiveness. And it's my belief that if they were adopted, the efficiency and effectiveness of our food assistance programs could certainly improve. Do you share that view, sir?
Very much so, Senator. Over the last 10 years, there have been a number of closed recommendations for AID and USDA on food for peace, on food aid, and that has improved the program, but the remaining ones should also be closed.
Yeah, so I want to commend the agency for closing those, but there's still a lot of important work to do.
Exactly.
On February 16, I introduced S418. It's a Department of State USAID Accountability Act of 2017, and it would require Congress to receive a report from agencies like State and AID about each of these open recommendations. We want them to identify an implementation timeline for each outstanding GAO recommendation, or an explanation as to why they don't intend to implement. It seems reasonable. So was able to work with the chairman and his staff to get that included in the Department of State Authorities bill, and then there was a variant of the legislation we included in this year's National Defense Authorization Act. And I'm working on broader legislation. Senator Coons is actually an original co-sponsor of this legislation that would require all federal agencies to report on outstanding recommendations from the IG and the GAO as part of their annual budget justification. Do you believe this type of legislation would improve the efficiency and effectiveness of agencies across our federal government?
So GAO cares very deeply on the implementation rate of recommendations. We strive for at least 80% of our recommendations to be closed. So any effort on the part of the Congress to improve the visibility and awareness and even pressure on the agencies to close the recommendations is welcome.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to a genuinely excellent panel providing detailed and thorough testimony on some of the maddening ongoing restrictions on effectiveness and efficiency in U.S. food aid and some of the genuinely inspiring efforts we are making jointly to meet a hungry world. Let me ask Dr. Barrett a question, if I might, about the Maritime Security Program, because we've explored it a little bit, but there's a lot of other issues. The Maritime Security Program is designed to ensure the Department of Defense has on-demand access to sea lift capacity during times of war or national emergency. You noted in your written testimony that the Department of Defense has never mobilized a mariner or vessel from the non-MSP cargo preference fleet. Is there any evidence that you've come across in your many years of working on this field to support the idea that cargo preference is necessary for our military sea lift capacity?
Thank you for the question, Senator Coons. No. The simple answer is no, as you already know. The military readiness of the cargo preference fleet is quite low. We have a large fleet that is militarily ready, but it's in the Ready Reserve Fleet, in the Military Sea Lift Command, and in the Maritime Security Program, which is essentially a call option on up to 60 ships, each paid $5 million a year for being prepared to mobilize for the Pentagon if and when needed. The Pentagon has never needed, even in recent times of war, to activate that whole set of those three types of resources: Ready Reserve Fleet, Military Sea Lift Command, and MSP. Cargo preference does not enhance military readiness. We have plenty of readiness through other mechanisms.
Thank you. I'll ask one other question, if I might. Our friend and colleague from Maryland, former Senator Mikulski, very pointedly asked me if we were to shift to a predominantly cash-based system of food assistance, wouldn't that undermine the coalition of groups, shippers, maritime unions, commodity groups that have historically advocated actively for Title II in-kind donations, leading to a reduction in overall food aid assistance, thus actually leading to fewer hungry people getting fed? Would any of the three of you care to comment on that assertion?
Senator Coombs, it's certainly true that there has been an unusual alliance of shippers, NGOs, and a few millers processors over the years to support Title II. This committee and the Congress have advanced alternative mechanisms that prove much more efficient in meeting the needs of emergency-affected populations, the Emergency Food Security Program in particular. If Title II were to go away, and I am a fan of Title II, but if it were to go away and there were to be augmentation of the EFSP budgets, we would see enhancement in the service of emergency-affected populations around the world. The Title II is declining steadily. Keep in mind, as I testified earlier, we have a 76% decline in inflation-adjusted terms in U.S. food aid programs since the heyday in the 1960s. So that coalition isn't maintaining the real purchasing power of the programs.
When you say 76%, you mean of those dollars dedicated to purchasing U.S. commodities and shipping them overseas?
Actually, the overall budget has declined by 76% in inflation-adjusted terms, and the margin that differentiates foreign flagged from U.S. flagged carriers has actually grown. Right. So the decline in true commodity terms is steeper still.
Mr. O'Keefe.
Thank you, Senator, for that question, and it's obviously an incredibly important one. And I think we as a country must do the right thing for the people who we're trying to serve and continue to find ways to learn from what we're doing and to improve it. And we're certainly committed to that at Catholic Relief Services. The caution just is my understanding in Europe, and Dr. Barrett and Mr. Melito may know more, but when they went from a in-kind to cash-based system, the total amount of resources went down enough to that the efficiency gain did not, right. kind of keep up. And so I just think that has to be thought through. I don't think that's a good excuse for doing things that are ineffective or inefficient, but I think maintaining political support for helping hungry people is something we have to exercise care about. The last thing I'll say in terms of the farmers, I do think that farmers here and understand farmers overseas, and the ones I've talked to don't understand the dynamics, and I think, Senator Corker, you made this point very clearly in your meeting with the Tennessee Farmer Association. They don't understand how it works and the kind of ineffectiveness at an aggregate level. But it does mean something to them at a human level, that things that they produce end up in the mouths of people who need it. And I just think that that's something that we should not toy with. That's real, that's
Absolutely.
human and American.
I too have spoken to the Farm Bureau in my state about this issue. There is a deep and deserved pride in America's agricultural community and families in being the most productive farmers on earth, in feeding a hungry world. But when they hear about the numbers and the inefficiency of how we currently do it, farmers tend to be pretty thrifty people. It makes them crazy and concerned that we be more efficient. So I am determined to work with all of you to sustain our support for U.S. food assistance, U.S. programs to efficiently meet the needs of a hungry world, rather than celebrating efficiency that leads to fewer being fed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Right.
We have about 30 seconds left on the first vote. There are 3 votes. I'm going to close out the meeting as soon as Senator Markey finishes, but I'm going to close it out now from my participation. I want to thank the 3 witnesses for being here. It's been outstanding. The record will remain open until the close of business Monday. I assume Senator Markey won't launch a nuclear war or do anything of that sort while we're going to vote. But please enjoy your time, sir, and I'm going to announce the meeting adjourned as soon as you finish. Thank you for being here.
And I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think you can trust me with my finger on the button, but I'm not sure. I think we need a hearing on other people having their finger on the button. So just one question, Mr. O'Keefe. Catholic Charities, how can the U.S. food aid programs better complement other humanitarian response efforts so that U.S. assistance also addresses the root causes of food insecurity, political conflict, violence, other issues? How can we do that?
Thank you so much, Senator. Catholic Relief Services does indeed think a lot about this very important question, particularly those of us in the humanitarian sector worked very closely together a year ago to prepare for the World Humanitarian Summit and developed a whole set of recommendations on humanitarian system reform that we look to drive forward. The most important thing for us is to continue to increase resources that go to hungry people to address both the emergency needs in the kind of creative ways that we've been discussing as part of this hearing, to continue to support and expand the Food for Peace development efforts that allow for getting people at the bottom of the income scale to develop the capacity to begin to connect with markets and have a pathway to sustainability, and then through Feed the Future to continue to expand market-based ways to get millions of farmers and people self-sufficient and addressing their own concerns about malnutrition, income, and other food security challenges. So the tools, I think, are coming into focus, and it's a question of expanding them. And then the last thing I'll say is just, so many, and this was alluded to earlier, so many of the problems we face are at their core political. And so we sometimes feel like we are picking up the pieces of problems that are outside of our hands. The people need this assistance, but we need to find political solutions to these conflicts.
Thank you. Thank you for that excellent answer, and thank you all so much for your testimony here today. We're in something that's an annual event, the budget, with 10, 20, 30 votes maybe today, so we apologize to you just for the way in which today is going to be conducted, but it doesn't in any way reduce the thanks that we have for you and the impressive nature of your testimony. Thank you so much. This hearing is adjourned.
Thank you. Thank you.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal, live every day with news and policy issues that impact you. Coming up Friday morning, we'll look at the federal response to the opioid epidemic in the U.S. with author Sam Quinones. And we'll discuss the future of the Iran nuclear agreement with Jamil Jaffer of George Mason University Law School. And NPR Justice correspondent Carrie Johnson on Attorney General Jeff Sessions' recent testimony. Be sure to watch C-SPAN's Washington Journal live at 7 Eastern Friday morning. Join the discussion.
This weekend, President Trump and 5 former presidents take part in a portion of the Deep from the Heart Hurricane Relief Concert happening on the campus of Texas A&M University. We'll take you there live Saturday night, beginning at 8:45 p.m. Eastern Time on C-SPAN.
Sunday night on Afterwards.
Over 90% of sexual harassment cases end up in settlements. And what does that mean? That means that the woman pretty much never works in her chosen career ever again, and she can never talk about it. She's gagged. Now, how else do we solve sexual harassment suits? We put in arbitration clauses in employment contracts, which make it a secret proceeding. So again, nobody ever finds out about it if you file a complaint. You can never talk about it, ever. Nobody ever knows what happened to you, and in most cases, you're also terminated from the company, and the predator in many cases is left to still work in the same position in which he was harassing you. So this is the way our society has decided to resolve sexual harassment cases, to gag women so that we can fool everyone else out there that we've come so far in 2017.
Former Fox News host Gretchen Carlson talks about sexual harassment in her new book, Be Fierce, Stop Harassment and Take Your Power Back. She's interviewed by Washington Post columnist Sally Quinn. Watch Afterwards Sunday night at 9 Eastern on C-SPAN 2's Book TV.
Now, members of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee look at efforts to improve public health outcomes and reduce health care costs. From Capitol Hill, this is about an hour and a half.
Pensions will please come to order. We have a vote at 11:45, but that should leave us an opportunity to hear from our witnesses and to have good time for questions. I told our witnesses that I was delighted to be talking about something other than the individual health insurance market. And I'm really quite serious about that because we know that the larger issues in health care are much more than the 6% of the people, every one of whom is important, who have to buy their insurance in the individual health insurance market. So we're glad to get, we're glad to have this discussion, and it's a subject on which both Republicans and Democrats have a lot of interest, and we look forward to your advice. Today we're holding a hearing to look at what can be done to encourage people to make healthier lifestyle choices to help prevent serious illnesses and reduce health care costs. Senator Murray and I will each have an opening statement, and then we'll introduce the witnesses. After the witnesses' testimony, senators will each have 5 minutes of questions. Let me say before I begin that I want to thank Senator Murray for her leadership and being a straightforward, tough negotiating partner on our efforts to present to the Senate a limited bipartisan bill to stabilize the insurance market during 2018 and 19. She and I will go to the Senate floor today at 1 o'clock and make a brief statement and put the text of the legislation in the congressional records so senators can examine it. We'll also list a significant number of Republican and Democratic co-sponsors for the legislation. And our hope is that now that we've put a proposal on the table, that the Senate will consider it, that the House will consider it, and the President will consider it. I talked with the President last night, and he encouraged the process, which he asked me to begin, and said he looked forward to considering it. I said, if you have suggestions for improving it, that's certainly your prerogative to do, and that's what we would expect to happen in the legislative process. So I thank Senator Murray for that and other members of the committee who've been involved in it. Over the last 7 years, we've endured this political stalemate over the Affordable Care Act, with most of the disagreement being over, as I said, a very small part of the health insurance market where 6% of Americans buy their insurance. Our stalemate has really been over all of health care. The fact that we've had that stalemate makes this even more refreshing to talk about an area of health care
on which most Americans, doctors, employers, Republicans, Democrats, agree. That consensus is that a healthy lifestyle leads to longer and better lives and reduces the nation's health care costs. According to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, health care spending in the United States has grown from consuming 9% of the gross domestic product in 1980 to nearly 18%, or $3.2 trillion in 2015, and predicted 20% in 2025. Cleveland Clinic, which is represented by one of our witnesses today, has said, if you achieve at least 4 of 6 normal measures of good health and 2 behaviors, you'll avoid chronic disease about 80% of the time. The 6 indicators of good health are familiar: blood pressure, cholesterol level, blood sugar, body mass index, smoking status, and your ability to fulfill the physical requirements of your job. The 2 behaviors are seeing your primary care physician regularly and keeping immunizations up to date. Again, if you hit 4 of the 6 indicators and keep up the 2 behaviors, according to the Cleveland Clinic, you'll avoid chronic diseases 80% of the time. This is important because we spend more than 84% of our health care costs, our $2.6 trillion, treating chronic diseases. That's something on which almost everyone agrees. So let's add to that another obvious fact. About 60% of Americans get their health insurance on the job. So if we really want to focus on improving the quality of health care in America, why not connect the consensus about wellness to the insurance policies that 178 million Americans get from their job? That's precisely what the Affordable Care Act sought to do in 2010. In fact, it was one of the only parts of the ACA that everybody seemed to agree on. Today's hearing is about how successful wellness initiatives have been and what we can do to make it easier to encourage people to lead healthier lives and reduce health care costs. Many employers have developed wellness programs to incentivize people to make healthier choices. These programs may reward behaviors such as exercising, eating better, quitting smoking, or offer employees a percentage of their insurance premiums for doing things like maintaining a healthy weight or keeping their cholesterol levels in check. These programs have the potential to save employers money and improve the health and well-being of their employees. Steve Bird, one of our witnesses, as CEO of Safeway, visited with many of us a few years ago and started a successful employee wellness program after he left Safeway, which I hope you'll talk about. That's one part of it. I'd also like to hear what communities and the federal government are doing to encourage healthy lifestyle choices. I know that Blue Cross Blue Shield of Tennessee partnered with local, state, and private organizations to fund community-level initiatives across our state, such as fitness zones in Chattanooga, programs in rural counties to promote healthy habits, and an interactive elementary school program to keep kids moving. An example of encouraging wellness at the federal level is the Medicare Diabetes Prevention Program, an intervention program for Medicare recipients diagnosed as pre-diabetic to prevent type 2 diabetes. Medicare spent an estimated $42 billion more in 2016 on people with diabetes than it would have spent if those recipients did not have diabetes. There are other ways to encourage healthier behavior, but it's hard to think of a better way to make a bigger impact on the health of millions of Americans than to connect the consensus about wellness to employer-based insurance for 178 million people. I look forward to the hearing. Senator Murray.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Alexander. Thank you to all of our colleagues and witnesses for joining us today. You know, we often think of health care as something you need when you get sick, but we should be thinking a lot more about ways we can help prevent families from getting sick in the first place and ending up in the doctor's office or the hospital. So I'm really glad that we're having today's hearing on how to better promote health and wellness, because the truth is we all have a role to play in supporting families' efforts to make healthy choices, whether it's government or communities or hospitals or schools, and certainly businesses, employers who can promote healthy behaviors in partnership with their communities. So I look forward to a robust discussion today around wellness and public health efforts that promote physical activity, improve access to healthy, affordable foods, especially for our kids, expand on science-based ways to reduce tobacco use, and a lot more. And I will be focused on making sure Congress is providing the investments needed to support local, state, and federal efforts to promote public health, and that includes grant programs by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that invest in community health centers, as well as the Prevention and Public Health Fund, which has made a difference for so many patients and families nationwide. Given our nation's high health care costs and the fact that so many of those costs can be attributed to chronic diseases, it is critical we do more to support public health efforts focused on health education and promotion. Now, I do want to be clear on the following. While we consider wellness programs, we have to do it in a balanced manner and make sure that we are protecting workers' civil rights and privacy. For me, and I know for a lot of my colleagues, the fact that employer wellness programs could impose significant financial penalties on workers who do not wish to share protected health information is a very serious concern. So I want to hear today more about what we need to do to make sure we find this right balance for wellness programs that protects workers' rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act and HIPAA and the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, 3 laws that were written and passed by this committee. And I have to be clear, responsibility for making sure that the rights of workers with disabilities and those who do not wish to share genetic information are protected and respected in these programs will rest with the Trump EEOC, which is exactly one of the reasons why Democrats pushed so hard against his recent nominees to the EEOC nominees, who I really am concerned don't show they were truly committed to protecting those workers from discrimination. So this is a balance, and we need to work on it and figure it out, and I really appreciate all of our witnesses who are being here to help share your information with us, and look forward to the discussion. And Mr. Chairman, I do have a letter from AARP that I want to submit for the record as well.
Thank you. It will be submitted. Thanks, Senator Murray. We'd ask each witness to please summarize your remarks in about 5 minutes. That'll give us more time to have questions back and forth from senators. First witness is Steve Byrd, founder and CEO of Byrd Health. He was CEO of Safeway for 20 years, and many of us met him when he roamed the halls during the debate on the Affordable Care Act, both the Democratic and Republican halls, with a message about wellness. Second, we'll hear from Dr. Michael Rosen, the Chief Wellness Officer and founding chair of the Wellness Institute at the Cleveland Clinic, a program that I just described in my opening remarks. Dr. David Ash is Executive Director of Penn Medicine Center at the Healthcare Innovation and John Morgan Professor, Perelman School of Medicine and the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. He's a leading behavioral economist with much research on healthy lifestyle choices. And then Jennifer Mathis is Director of Policy and Legal Advocacy at the Judge David L. Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law. She supervises the Senator's policy work and engages in advocacy. Why don't we start with you, Mr. Byrd? Welcome.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I think the first thing I'd like to say is that I very much appreciate the opportunity to share my experience in the wellness category with the committee here. And I really want to applaud your willingness to work in a bipartisan fashion to improve the health of Americans and ultimately legislation that attaches to that. I'm going to go quickly through a little bit of background on what I've done since I left Safeway in the CEO position, because it's impacted how I think about the subject. Secondly, I want to talk about why we picked wellness as a real important area. Third, I'm going to cover the elements of the wellness program that we introduced at Safeway. I think it's most instructive because we've had a 10-year run, so we know what the statistics look like after some 10 years. And then finally, I'm going to speak to the results that we achieved, which I think are extraordinary and I think indicative of what others can do. And then finally, I want to talk about what I think are the 5 keys to success in a company wellness plan, because most people have failed at this, and I know that Michael and I and maybe others here that will testify have succeeded. and I think you'll find some common success elements. After leaving Safeway, while at Safeway, as the chairman indicated, I got very involved in healthcare and discovered that it was a fascinating area, a great opportunity to improve the health of Americans, opportunity to improve care without adding to costs, and frankly, an opportunity to dramatically lower costs. And so I committed to spending the next 10 years of my life, and I've now spent 4 in this space. What I wanted to do was to tell you briefly what my company does. Is we do 3 things that are unique. We're able to lower a company or organization's cost actually 40 to 50%, simultaneously lower the employee's expense about 6 to 10%. We're also capable of significantly improving the care they receive, and if they're willing, we can have a dramatic effect on the wellness of their population, which has profound effects on the productivity of that workforce. I picked wellness back in 2008 because we took note that about 70% of all healthcare costs are driven by healthcare behavior. So we thought as a self-insured employer with the right to design a plan, however we chose, we could actually affect behaviors and people would become healthier. But I want to just put into context for you, because I know you will at some point want to understand how to reduce costs, that in the short run, there are other ways to reduce costs more significantly. The first one I would mention would be provider efficiency, then plan discipline, plan design, and then wellness. In the first 5 years, I put wellness in the 4th place. In the next 5 to 10 years, I would put it probably close to 2nd place or 3rd place. So there's an opportunity there. On the wellness front, we put together a program at Safeway, and we made it a voluntary program, which I'm not sure everybody understood at the time. And 85% of our employees opted into this plan, and 70% of the spouses opted into this plan. We rewarded people for achieving certain biometric standards with about $600 worth of reward. And when we polled people, as we did annually, about 78% of the participants viewed the program as either very good or excellent. And what we measured with blood pressure, HbA1c, cholesterol, tobacco use, and BMI. As I said, the results were amazing. And I'll give you a 2-year look after starting the program. Of the people that failed the blood pressure standard, 2 years later, 73% of them passed, and they maintained that over the balance of the program. Pre-diabetics, of those that failed initially, 45% of them passed 2 years later. Cholesterol level, 43% of those passed 2 years later. Smokers, I've got a number of 35%, but in fairness, you can beat that test. And so while we did improve the smoking, 35% is a bit strong. And then we took the obesity rate of our population from 28% down to 21%. I had a goal to be, if we were a state, we'd be the lowest obesity state in the United States. Senator Bennett, at that time, Colorado held that position. And so when I left in 2013, we matched Colorado at 21%. I want to just shift quickly because it says I have 9 seconds left. Why did we succeed? First of all, we rewarded on outcomes, not participation. The vast majority of programs, they say they're outcome-based. They're not. They're participation-based. We had to put a meaningful amount of money at stake. We viewed that starting point as about $600. We needed to provide support tools that would allow people to actually change their behavior and enhance their state of health. And then we needed to surround it with an ecosystem that constantly convinced the employee that we cared about their health. We can talk more about that in the Q&A. And then we consciously developed a culture of health and fitness. I did this when I was about 57 years of age, and I understood that my fitness level down the road was going to determine my state of health. Once you become immobile, your health begins to decline. So we focused on health and fitness. And then lastly, it needs leadership. And I practice this with clients today. And if you don't have CEO leadership, it just doesn't work. And I would contend you can't pick 3 of the 5. In my experience, you have to do all 5.
Thank you, Mr. Byrd. Dr. Royson, welcome.
Thank you. Chairman Alexander, Ranking Member Murray, members of the committee, my name is Dr. Mike Roizen, and I thank you for the opportunity to testify today before your committee. Since 2007, I have served as the Chief Wellness Officer at the Cleveland Clinic. In this capacity, I lead the clinic's work in preventing illness and helping people live longer, healthier lives. We give people more time. Keeping people well and enabling them to live their best lives is not just my professional goal, it's my passion, my life's work, and the passion of the Cleveland Clinic. Thank you for your leadership in holding this important hearing. In fact, the title of the hearing encapsulates the Cleveland Clinic story. That is, how healthy choices can improve health outcomes and substantially reduce medical costs. We're hopeful that sharing the results of our efforts over the last 9 years can demonstrate that we as a nation can have real impacts on the health of our people while resulting in hundreds, literally hundreds of billions of dollars in savings for both the private sector and the federal government. For years, the central health care debate in Washington has been about what role government should play in providing health insurance. But if leaders in Washington don't address the skyrocketing costs of health care caused by the influx of chronic disease, it won't matter whether Medicare, Medicaid, private insurance, or individuals pay the bills. Everyone in this room has seen the CBO estimates. Unless we do something to bend the cost curve, we'll all be bankrupt from this influx of chronic disease that is growing 5 to 7 times faster than the population. There is, however, something that both the federal government and private insurers could do right now to significantly reduce health care costs across the country, a step that could save our nation hundreds of billions over 10 years, and with voluntary participation. 9 years ago, the Cleveland Clinic began an ambitious experiment to improve the health and wellness of its employees and their families. The clinic's Rewards for Healthy Choice program provides employees who voluntarily chose to do so, much like Mr. Byrd, with compensation for reaching several outcomes, wellness outcomes and medical outcomes that you mentioned, each year. The program is born of a few key insights about the causes of chronic disease and the drivers of health care spending. It starts with the fact that 84% of all health care costs are due to chronic disease, and 75% of chronic diseases are driven by 6 measurable factors: your blood pressure, your body mass index, your fasting blood sugar or hemoglobin A1C, your LDL cholesterol, whether you smoke or not, we measure it by urine cotinine levels, and unmanaged stress. These 6 predictors of chronic disease are controllable in well over 90% of individuals. The Cleveland Clinic Rewards for Healthy program focuses on helping its 100,000 employees and dependents get and keep these 6 measurements normal, combined with encouraging those 2 additional behaviors, seeing a primary care provider regularly, and keeping immunizations up to date. The clinic program helps employees get these 6 normals. These way we do it is we pay employees, that is, we incentivize employees, and we started very small, but ended up by increasing payments to about the same number as Mr. Byrd to achieve the 6 normals and the 2 behaviors. The upshot: since the onset of the program, the Cleveland Clinic has saved $254 million in direct medical costs, increasing yearly. This year, we will save over $150 million more versus the Milliman benchmark, as more of our employees get and stay healthy. Further, their improved health is reflected in substantial reductions in unscheduled sick leave, and the 62% of clinic employees who voluntarily participate in the program have seen their health care costs and premiums decrease, now by $600 for individuals to $2,000 annually for families. For hitting these targets, smoking rates have decreased from 15.4% to under 5%, while the state of Ohio's is around 23%. Body mass index of employees for all 100,000 employees taken together is decreasing 0.5% per year, as opposed to the nation's increasing 0.37% per year. Blood pressure, LDL cholesterol, and hemoglobin A1C levels have improved substantially, resulting in over 11% decrease in the need for illness care since 2009, rather than the expected and projected 20% increase due to our aging population. The Cleveland Clinic model has been replicated with our help by 9 other large employers, all of whom have seen similar impressive results. For example, Lafarge, a national construction supply company, is saving over 46% of expected medical costs as estimated by Aetna. And we know that other organizations can learn from these examples. In short, the Cleveland Clinic Rewards for Healthy Choice program is doable, exportable, and scalable across the country. The clinic has been working to educate lawmakers on this idea, and Senators Ron Wyden and Rob Portman are collaborating to work in the Senate Finance Committee aimed at reducing the costs and improving health of Medicare beneficiaries. But it doesn't have to stop with federal programs. Private sector programs supported by this committee could benefit by the work we've pioneered. This program has at least 3 critical virtues. It's been tested in multiple settings across different populations and patient groups, everything from engineers to blue-collar workers. It's entirely voluntary, and it enables the federal government to achieve substantial cost savings without any of the programmatic budget cuts and without any initial costs. Bending the cost curve through voluntary wellness and incentive programs is a common-sense idea that both Democrats and Republicans should be able to rally around for both the health of our nation's finances and the health of our people, and it increases our competitiveness for jobs. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Royson. Dr. Ashe, welcome.
Chairman Alexander, Ranking Member Murray, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is David Ashe, and I'm a practicing physician and a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm here to talk about workplace health programs and their role in the nation's health. My summary message is this: I believe that employer-sponsored wellness programs have value to contribute. I believe that even though the health and financial benefits of these programs are often overstated, I believe that even though some of these programs, in the ways they are currently designed, risk treating some employees unfairly, but I'm optimistic about these programs going forward because we are learning how to design them to be much more effective and much more fair. Americans spend most of their time outside of the healthcare system. Even those with a chronic illness spend only a few hours a year in front of a doctor. But we spend about 5,000 waking hours a year doing everything else in our lives. And it's during those 5,000 hours when so many of the determinants of our health unfold. How we eat, whether we exercise, smoke, or take our prescribed medications. We can put more and more money into healthcare, but much of our health is determined in the 5,000 waking hours outside the reach of doctors and hospitals. Americans spend many of those waking hours at work, and employers have a large financial incentive to advance health, not just because of our system of employment-based health insurance, but also because healthier workers are more productive. And so more than 3/4 of large employers now have some sort of workplace wellness program targeting risk factors that you've heard about already that account for much of chronic illness, risk factors like tobacco use, high blood pressure, obesity, and the like. Unfortunately, it's a lot easier to know what conditions to target than it is to know how to do so. Managing these conditions requires substantial behavior change. Our nation has invested considerably in the science of medical treatment, as it should, but less in the science of behavior change. Our knowledge of how to break old habits and develop healthier ones is rudimentary, but it's getting better. Behavioral economics is one example of how we are learning more about changing behavior. Just last week, Richard Thaler of the University of Chicago won the Nobel Prize in economics for recognizing that we all succumb to irrational tendencies that compete with our long-term goals. Increasingly, behavioral economics has been used to help doctors and patients make better decisions, and I'm proud to say that the University of Pennsylvania is a world leader in this field. One such irrationality is called loss aversion. We are much more motivated to avoid a $100 loss than we are to achieve a $100 gain. It doesn't make economic sense, but it's how humans tend to think. We found this recently when encouraging overweight employees at a large firm to increase their fitness. In one group, employees were given $1.40 for each day that they walked at least 7,000 steps. That's a standard economic financial incentive. For another group, we structured it as a loss. $1.40 a day is $42 a month. So in that group, we gave each employee $42 at the beginning of the month, and we took away $1.40 for every day they didn't walk 7,000 steps. An economist would see those two designs as the same. For every day you walk 7,000 steps, you are $1.40 richer. But it turned out that those who received $1.40 were no more likely to walk 7,000 steps than those who received no incentive at all. But those who had $1.40 taken away if they didn't walk 7,000 steps were 50% more likely to succeed. Mathematically and financially, these two approaches are the same, but one worked and the other didn't. Most large companies are using financial incentives to encourage healthy behaviors. The vast majority of them do so by adjusting the premiums their employees pay for their health insurance. Although it may seem obvious that charging higher premiums for being a smoker or being overweight would encourage people to modify their habits, there is little evidence that programs designed that way often work. At best, they provide modest financial benefits to employers and unclear health benefits to employees. These programs offer promise, but they also draw criticism. I remain, nevertheless, excited about well-designed programs that help Americans change the behaviors they want to change, help them quit tobacco, help them lose weight, help them better manage their high blood pressure. Those changes are much less likely to come from typical premium-based financial incentives and much more likely to come from approaches that reflect the underlying psychology of how people make decisions, encouraged by frequent rewards, emotional engagement, contests, and social acceptance. Those are the ingredients of successful programs, and they are missing from most of what employers currently do. We know so much more about how to design financial and other incentives to motivate human behavior, far more now than even 10 years ago. I haven't seen much of this new knowledge applied effectively by employers, but there is no reason why it can't be. Thank you for inviting me to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Ashe. Ms. Mathis, welcome.
Thank you. Chairman Alexander, Ranking Member Murray, and members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to testify about this important issue. My name is Jennifer Mathis, and Chairman Alexander noted my position at the Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law, but I am here also as a representative of the Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities, or CCD, a coalition of over 100 national disability organizations that work together to promote public policy, ensuring the self-determination, independence, empowerment, integration, and inclusion of adults and children with disabilities in all aspects of society. I appreciate the breadth of the topic for this hearing. Obviously, there are many different ways that we can promote healthy choices that improve health outcomes and reduce costs, and many different stakeholders who can do so. The primary concern that animates this hearing seems to be the role of employer-based wellness programs, but I also think it is important to mention the role of state service systems, particularly those for people with disabilities and older adults, in planning and administering service systems in a way that expands opportunities for independence, choice, and autonomy, enabling people to exert more control and participate actively in their own health care, direct their own lives, and work. We have seen from numerous studies over many years that realigning service systems to offer people with disabilities the chance to live, work, and receive services in their own communities leads to improved health outcomes and also lowers costs. So I'm happy to answer any questions about that, but I will focus the rest of my comments on workplace wellness programs. CCD has supported the development of wellness programs as a tool to improve life and health outcomes. But those programs can and must operate in a way that respects longstanding and important workplace protections, such as those provided by the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, and the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, or GINA, especially workplace privacy protections. People with disabilities need these protections. The employment rate of people with disabilities is much lower than that of any other group tracked by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They are employed at less than half of the rates of people without disabilities. Study after study that has examined why the employment rate of people with disabilities is so low cites attitudinal barriers as one of the chief reasons. Perceptions that people with disabilities are incapable continue to be pervasive, including in our workplaces. It was precisely for that reason that when Congress passed the ADA, one of our most important civil rights laws for people with disabilities, it created strict protections to enable employees to keep their health and disability-related information confidential in the workplace.
Employees could be subjected to medical exams or inquiries only if they were job-related or if they were voluntary inquiries that were part of an employee health program. GINA provided similar protections for employees' genetic information, including their spouse's health information. Removing or weakening those hard-won protections would make many people with disabilities vulnerable in their workplaces and expose them to the risks that Congress meant to avoid. Last year, the EEOC significantly rolled back the protection that it had enforced for many years to ensure that employers could not penalize employees for declining to provide their health information as part of a wellness program. The agency instead permitted steep financial penalties for employees who choose to keep their health information private, and more steep penalties if their spouses chose to keep their health information private, making this choice far from a voluntary one for many people. A federal judge has now ruled that the agency violated the law and failed to provide a reasoned justification for this change in position. The agency now has an opportunity to revisit its regulations and do the right thing to afford people the rights guaranteed by the ADA and GINA. We believe it is not difficult for the EEOC to ensure that wellness programs serve to promote the healthy choices and healthy outcomes while respecting important civil rights of people with disabilities. The agency set out a path for doing this in its 2010 regulations implementing GINA, clarifying that financial incentives can be used, but not for questions asking for genetic information. The same rules should apply to questions at seeking health information of an employee or a spouse. The lead study on wellness programs conducted for the Department of Labor highlighted many strategies other than incentives that have made wellness programs more effective. Good wellness programs can be designed without eroding the civil rights of people with disabilities, and we will all be better served if that happens. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mathis. We'll now have a round of 5-minute questions. We'll start with Senator Young.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm very excited about this hearing because I know a number of our witnesses have discussed in their testimonies behavioral economics and behavioral decision-making. And I think it's really important that we as policymakers incorporate how people really behave, not according to an economist per se, or according to other policy experts, but based on observed behaviors. Oftentimes we behave in ways that we don't intend to. It leads us to results that we don't want to end up in. So, Mr. Ash, I'll start with you, with your expertise in this area. You've indicated behavioral economics is being used to help doctors and patients make better decisions, and you see an opportunity for employers to help Americans change their behaviors to in ways they want, from tobacco mitigation to losing weight to managing blood pressure. And you indicate those changes are much less likely to come from typical premium-based financial incentives and much more likely to come from approaches that reflect the underlying psychology of how people make decisions, encouraged by frequent rewards, emotional engagement, contests, social acceptance, and so forth. And then you said in your verbal testimony you haven't seen much of this new knowledge applied effectively by employers, but there's no reason why it cannot be. And so my questions for you, sir, are what might they learn from behavioral economists, just in summary fashion?
Sure. Well, thank you, Senator. I think I'll start by saying that there's a misunderstanding often about behavioral economics and health. Many people believe that if you use financial incentives to change behavior, you're engaged in behavioral economics, and I would say no, that's just economics. It becomes behavioral economics when you use an understanding of our little psychological foibles and pitfalls to sort of supercharge the incentives and make them more potent so that you don't have to use incentives that are so large. So I think that there are a variety of approaches that come from behavioral economics that can be applied in the employment setting and elsewhere. I mentioned one, which is capitalizing on the notion that losses loom larger than gains might be a new way to structure financial incentives in the employment setting in ways that might make it more potent and more palatable and easier for all employees to participate in programs to advance their health. The delivery of incentives more frequently, for example, or using contests, or certain kinds of social norming where it's acceptable to show people on leaderboards and contests and get people engaged in fun towards their health. All of these are possibilities.
So thank you very much. And you really need to study these different phenomena individually, I think, to have a sense of the growing body of work that is behavioral economics, right? So we need to increase awareness and I guess the education of many employers about some of these tics we have, and that seems to be part of the answer. In fact, Richard Thaler, who just won the Nobel Prize for his groundbreaking work in this area, indicated that we as policymakers ought to have on a regular basis not just lawyers and economists at the table as we're drafting, but we ought to have a behavioral scientist as well. In the UK, they have the Behavioral Insights team. The United States, our previous administration had a similar sort of team that did a number of experiments to figure out how policies would actually impact individuals' health and wellness and a number of other things. Some of the ideas that I think we might incorporate into the government context, and tell me if any of these sort of pop for you, if you think they make sense. We need to continue to have unit or units embedded within government that do a lot of these experiments. We need to have a clearinghouse of best practices that others, employers included, might draw on. This doesn't have to be governmental, but it could certainly be. We on Capitol Hill might actually consider, aside from having a congressional budget office, we might have an entity or at least some presence within the CBO of individuals who understand how people would actually respond to given proposals. Do any or all of those make sense to you?
Well, thank you for your remarks. I think they all make sense to me, and one of the lessons that I guess I have repeatedly learned is that seemingly subtle differences in design can make a huge difference in how effective a program can be and how it's perceived. And that's, we ultimately care about the impact of these programs. So I'm very much in favor of a greater use of these programs, but in addition, greater study of these programs, because I think we need an investment in the science that will help all of us get better at delivering these activities, not just in healthcare, but in other parts of society.
Makes a lot of sense. I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Young. Senator Murray.
Thank you. Dr. Rosen, I want to start with you. We've heard a lot today about workplace wellness programs, but as I mentioned, I think it's critically important we think about how the investments we make in our communities can also play a critical role in making the healthy choice the easy choice for our families in this country. In my home state of Washington, we have seen a lot of these really critical efforts in our schools, for example. We're investing in physical education and healthy food and beverage preparation. In our cities and towns, we're working to make the environment more accessible to all users, bicycles, pedestrians, people of all ages and abilities. Our healthcare providers are making it easier to quit smoking and taking steps to better support breastfeeding, for example. And our communities of color are taking strides to ensure strong culturally competent programs to promote the health of people in my state. So I wanted to ask you, do you agree, Ms. Mathis sort of mentioned it, in addition to these workplace-based programs, community-based efforts to promote health and wellness are also important?
Absolutely. The answer is absolutely agree. And your state and your schools are taking a leadership role that the rest of the nation would love to follow, and hopefully we'll be able to. And what I mean by that is when you get kids to be healthy and in fact influence their parents to be healthy, when you get food manufacturers to make foods for large distribution to your schools that are healthy, you really get to change the health of a whole generation. So we totally applaud that. We work with that. In fact, I go and we have a network of what we call inner and outer ring schools around Cleveland, and it's very hard to get appropriate products for the school lunches, et cetera, and breakfast. And so your state is taking a lead in that, and we thank you.
Oh, thank you. Ms. Mathis, I wanted to ask you, as you well know, a federal district court recently held that the EEO Commission failed to support its rules on wellness programs. Those rules said that an employee's decision not to participate in a wellness program was voluntary so long as the employee did not have to pay a penalty greater than 30% of the cost of health insurance, in other words, thousands of dollars. That high of a penalty is a problem for the millions of employees and their spouses who do not wish to risk disclosure of genetic information or the existence of a disability by participating in wellness programs that do collect, of course, sensitive health information. It's a person's right. It's a right under the ADA. It's a right under Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, under HIPAA, and those are, as I said, 3 laws this committee wrote and I'm proud of. As you may well know, this committee met yesterday and cleared for the full Senate the Trump's administration nominees to now lead the EEOC. And among other things, those nominees will now be responsible for rewriting those wellness rules. So I wanted to ask you, how should the EEOC set criteria for when participation in a wellness program is not voluntary? And what advice would you give those 5 members of the EEOC?
I think the most important thing for the EEOC to remember is that their job is to apply the ADA and not to rewrite it, to try to conform it to another law that also applies at the same time but did not overturn or modify the ADA. There are many circumstances where 2 laws apply at the same time and, one requires additional things beyond what the other requires, or we have a lot of experience with applying multiple laws to the same set of circumstances. They already have a framework that they had used for 16 years under the ADA, and they used the same framework to analyze what is a voluntary question under GINA in their 2010 regulations, implementing a parallel provision of GINA, allowing requests for an employee's genetic information as part of a voluntary wellness program. And I would just point out that that GINA regulation was done after the Affordable Care Act, and they considered the 2 laws and the fact that the Affordable Care Act had been passed with its provisions about wellness programs and considered those consistent. That framework was logical. It used the ordinary meaning of voluntary, that you can't require a person to answer or penalize a person for not answering a question. That's consistent with the dictionary definition of voluntary, which is not impelled by outside influence or unconstrained by interference or without valuable consideration. And having steep financial incentives, I think, is actually the dictionary definition of what is not voluntary. So having the same kind of framework, the same path that they charted for the 2010 GINA regulations to apply also to the ADA, which is how they interpreted the ADA before 2016 for many, many years, to allow wellness programs to have incentives, but just not to incentivize or to have significant incentives for people turning over health information that's not job related. And that, I think, would allow wellness programs to proceed and develop and use incentives in other ways and use many other strategies to engage people without eroding the civil rights of people with disabilities.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Murray. Senator Isaacson.
Thank you, Senator Alexander. Mr. Byrd, if I remember correctly, the Safeway program had financial incentives for participation by employees. Is that right?
Could you repeat the question?
Did the Safeway program have financial incentives for the employees for participating in the wellness program?
Correct.
What have you found in your work with wellness programs with companies are the best financial incentives to put in place for your wellness program to induce more people to participate?
Yeah, I think we had extraordinary participation. I think even greater, Michael, than some of the numbers that you had. We were 85% voluntary for employees, 70% for spouses. I'm actually a big fan of both the 96 HIPAA regs. I thought they were really well thought out. And the adjustments that were made with the Affordable Care Act, I thought those were equally well thought out. What I don't want the committee to do is get the impression that it's all about incentives. Incentives are, I think, necessary, but by themselves not sufficient. And going back to something that, David, you had said earlier, the secret sauce at Safeway was creating small support groups. We had thousands of groups that came together on their own, set goals and objectives, time frames. They might have been exercise goals, it might have been weight loss goals. We gave them the tools to accomplish that, the tools to track one another. And it really was a driving force in this, along with CEO leadership. So I look at government as being an enabler in this process, but I also think there's an opportunity for government to lead. You know, and I think others have been down here over the years, and one opportunity to lead is I would love to see the federal government adopt programs like this, you know, for their own employees. I actually offered to do this for Secretary Sebelius and the 80,000 people at HHS to do it for free. Unfortunately, that was about 30 days before she left office, and she was excited about that. But it's not just about incentives, and it's important that, you know, we employed 10,000 people with disabilities at Safeway out of 185,000 people. 2,000 of them were part of this program, and the HIPAA regs, when I say they're well thought out, they allow for and frankly require, if the standard that you've set is judged to be too difficult, that you adopt a different standard and even provide a waiver. In our experience, and I'd be interested in what you've done at the Cleveland Clinic, about 3 to 4% would reach for and get either a waiver or an alternative standard. So while we wanted you to get below a 30 BMI, if you had a 45 BMI and you made 10% progress, we gave you the reward. At the end of the year when you measured, we gave you a reimbursement check. And we enjoyed writing those checks. So it was all about encouraging wellness. And if you had comorbidities and your physician said, look, I'd feel better at going from 45 to 43, we would say, fine. You know, that's the standard. And then we would change that over time, and I'm sure the Cleveland Clinic did something very similar.
Well, I appreciate the answer, because being one who's had about every bad habit you could possibly have to be a poor contributor to your health at one time or another, I know that what got me into health programs and wellness programs was the desire to change a habit. What kept me in them was the reward of that habit changing.
Yeah.
And I think you said something that's very important, and that is if you give the employee or the individual the measurements to show improvement and reinforce that along the way, you can change what's a program to induce them to be more healthy to an employee who is more healthy. Because I know quitting smoking, changing your eating habits, exercising regularly, none of those things are easy. Everybody likes to talk about them, and every New Year's, everybody practices them for about 2 days, but then they go away because they're hard to do. But if you get reinforcement in a peer group in a positive way, you can really sustain the practice.
You know, if I could just add one more thing, I think that I learned this a long time ago in business, and it was helpful. I had 1,800 stores. Rather than just study and hypothesize things, we just did it. We did it on scale, and then we scaled it up. And for example, if I wanted to increase the sales of some product, I put it in the ad, I reduced the price, and I put it on an end cap. At the end of the day, I didn't care which of those three contributed most to that. I did all three of them every time I wanted to increase the sales by, 20-fold. And so, we struck upon something over time that worked, and it worked famously. And we had no issues with it. And if you don't know, the health statistics don't go to the HR department. They don't know what somebody's BMI is. They know there's a contribution to premium effect, but they really don't know what somebody passed and what somebody failed. And we didn't have any issues in the company, and then we ultimately began rolling that out to all the divisions. So our initial population was 40,000 members.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just conclude with a compliment. Thank you, Dr. Rosen, for your reference to what the Finance Committee was doing. We've in fact now done it. The Chronic Care Working Group bill has actually passed the Senate Finance Committee, and it's passed the Senate, and it's pending now in the Energy Committee in the House. So we're close to getting that 3-year effort done. I appreciate your reference to that.
May I make another comment? I think a couple of things he said deserve re-emphasis. One is there's an absolute firewall between the health plan and the company. They don't know why the premiums are where they are or what's driving or not driving it. Secondly, for every person, they interact with their primary care physician in achieving those goals, those 6 goals plus 2 behaviors. And it is the primary care physician and they set a goal and set a progress, and it is that relationship and that progress that determines their incentive. But it is a culture change. It is multiple programs that work. It is leadership as well. And then we also have a large buddy system that we set up that really does the support system. So there are a lot of things. I didn't get into the nuts and bolts, but it is a lot of things that work.
Thank you, Senator Isaacson. Senator Franken.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding, and to the ranking member for holding this important hearing. Before the hearing started, I spoke to all of you about housing. You know, these wellness programs that the employer run are very helpful, but what we're trying to do is to help people be healthy and lower the cost of their health care in the long run. And Mrs. Mathis, you point out research that shows a strong connection between a person's health and stable housing, despite the fact that they're actually very often talked about as completely separate issues. In Minnesota, Hennepin County, Hennepin Health, an accountable care organization in the Twin Cities, saw the lack of stable housing was a major barrier to improving the health of their members. So they decided to develop a program that paired health care, housing, and social services. Just 1 year after participants in the program were placed in supportive housing, Hennepin Health saw significant reductions in participant hospitalizations and psychiatric care and imprisonment or in going to jail. You know, the #1 cure for homelessness turns out to be a home. And then if you can wrap around supportive services, it yields amazing savings. I brought this up to all of you. So Ms. Mathis and all of you, could you speak to how a focus on housing, particularly when it's paired with social supports, can lower health care costs and improve health outcomes?
No, I think that's absolutely right. That's, I think, a recognition that has become increasingly prevalent in state mental health service systems. Maybe 20, 25 years ago, state mental health directors would have said, we don't do housing, we're not in the business of housing, we do mental health. That has changed dramatically. I think now, you know, most state mental health authorities would tell you we do housing. Housing is a critical part of what we do. Housing supports, housing subsidies, housing assistance, housing locator assistance, all of that, because all of these things, housing, stability, work, are all the social determinants of health have been shown to have an enormous impact on people's health. And there have been many studies done. I think some of the interesting ones have been studies of people who are homeless versus people who are in supportive housing, kind of similar twin studies of people in those two situations where it costs us as much money to keep people homeless as it does to have them stably housed with services.
I want to hear from the others too, as well, because you all seem to respond when I brought this up.
Senator Franken, thanks for the question and comment. I fully agree. There is certainly a movement and a knowledge base called Housing First that recognizes the critical, central, actually fundamental importance of housing for those without it. I would probably embed your question in a much larger set of issues that reflect the importance of the social determinants of health. If you're a provider organization, a hospital or health system, and you face patients who are chronically ill and are readmitted into their hospital multiple times for congestive heart failure or lung disease or some chronic illness, almost always the major determinant, in addition to their serious illness that brings them back to the hospital, is some form of social circumstance. Sometimes it's inadequate housing, sometimes it's another form of social support. At the time when hospitals were incentivized only to deliver health care, those considerations were, at least from a financial perspective, less relevant. Now hospitals and health systems are much more aware of their responsibility to be part of the solution to the social factors that affect health, including housing, and some of the most progressive health systems are targeting housing directly along with other social determinants. Those social determinants were always there, and now we need to think about financial incentives that will, at the organizational level, that would allow the resources that we have in our society to address them.
I want to give the other two witnesses a chance to answer Senator Franken's question, but I want to stay pretty close to the time because we have votes at 11:45.
Well, some would say, Senator Franken, you're a genius for bringing this up, because it is really the social determinants, as have been said, is in fact.
Thank you.
Franken might say that. But the social determinants are really important. It's very hard to not have stress if you don't have a home. It's very hard to get adequate sleep without housing. And those are really key points in getting well and in staying well and in lowering the cost of medical care.
First of all, I wanted you to know that if he hadn't said you were a genius, I was ready to weigh in on that.
And I was ready to do it as well.
My wife and I have been involved for several years in a philanthropic effort to provide housing to the homeless. And I'm also involved in another philanthropic effort with a good friend where we take people who have been homeless and have the capability to learn a skill, and they're taught the skill, and then we find them a job, and they can succeed at that. So I think having a home is really important, and that social environment that surrounds it is also something that we create.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Franken. We'll go to Senator Casey next.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the panel for being here and for your testimony on these important issues. I'll direct, I think, most of my question time to both Dr. Ash and Ms. Mathis. I wanted to say first, Dr. Ash, we're grateful you're here and grateful for the work you do at Penn. I guess you've done work at both the Perelman School of Medicine and at Wharton, but also want to thank you for the work you've done at the VA Medical Center in Philadelphia as well. Critically important work. I know that I wasn't here for Senator Murray's questions, but I believe she asked a question about the penalties and the incentives. Am I right about that? Just want to make sure. And I guess my my follow-up to that line of questioning would be, with regard to you, Dr. Ash, that your research indicates the penalty incentives may not have had the effect on individual behaviors. And both you and Dr. Roizen have both indicated the importance of the many hours, I guess 5,000 hours of waking activity when we're not interacting with the healthcare system. Senator Murray indicated that some wellness plans use both penalties and rewards that can be as high as thousands of dollars a year. We've heard that Dr. Roizen's program uses a 30% penalty, the limit that the EEOC has set when it issued the rule last year. So my question is basically this: based upon your research and other behavioral economic research, is it necessary to use such large penalties or rewards? And if not, what would you recommend such rewards or penalties to be?
Well, thank you for your question, Senator Casey, and I think you've identified some critical issues at the interface of effectiveness and voluntariness right there. So I think a lot of employers are under what I would consider to be the mistaken impression that the way to make incentives effective is to make them larger and larger. And that naturally leads to very large incentives putting large amounts of money at risk, whether they're in the form of rewards or penalties. And we've heard, of course, that penalties are more off-putting than rewards and actually sort of jack up the concerns about the lack of voluntariness. But I think it's potentially a mistake to think that way. I actually think that that is old, outdated thinking, that the only way to increase the potency of an incentive is to increase the size of an incentive. I think instead, we know from years of research now in behavioral economics that the way we design incentives probably has much more of an impact than the amount of an incentive. You can imagine, for example, a $500 incentive that might be bundled into someone's paycheck. Well, if they're paid once a week, that's $10 a week. it looks much smaller then. It's put alongside all sorts of other elements in the paycheck. It may not even be seen. It's directly deposited. You can imagine handing someone 2 crisp $100 bills, a much smaller incentive, and have it be much more potent emotionally. I think another mistake that employers make often, but they don't need to make, is setting explicit targets for goals. If you believe that your employee should be at a BMI of 25, which is, let's say, the upper limit of normal, and you set that as the goal, that's a good way to make people whose BMI is 26 lose a few pounds. But if your BMI is 40, that's a demoralizing goal. What we care about is improvement. And pay for improvement programs are going to be far more effective for the people who we fundamentally need to help the most. So I think both design elements with the structure of incentives and design elements with the targets for incentives can be improved by most employers. And I'm really optimistic that they can do that.
Thank you. And I have more to pursue there, but I want to move to a separate line of questioning. Ms. Mathis, I'll start with you, and I'll invite others to answer as well. The written testimony you have regarding balancing the personal rights of individuals, especially those with disabilities, while also pursuing the goal or encouraging wellness. Your references to the privacy protections in the Americans with Disabilities Act and other statutes are critically appreciated, I think, at this time. We know that October is National Disability Employment Awareness Month, and as you've pointed out in your testimony, the employment rate for those with disabilities is very low in comparison to the general population. Those with disabilities have the lowest rate of employment of any sector of our population, and I'm concerned that aggressive wellness programs could not only discriminate against a person with a disability, but also create a workplace climate that doesn't value people with disabilities. Would you like to comment on that further?
Sure, and I should just clarify that I think our primary concern about the large financial incentives is around those privacy protections. Folks have talked about the incentives for outcomes, and as Mr. Byrd mentioned, there are built-in safeguards in the Affordable Care Act that, I think do address that concern that if you can't meet a particular health outcome because of a disability, that you are supposed to get a reasonable alternative standard, and there are regulations that sort of, implement that. And I don't think that, certainly we haven't heard that there are a lot of, that's a major concern anymore. I think that was addressed. Our concern is really much more around the privacy issues. And, it is true that I think there, in many cases, the information will not go directly to an employer. Sometimes it will if the employer does directly run a wellness program. With small employers, obviously, it's sometimes not that hard to figure out who has what health condition that's identified in aggregate data. And frankly, I think for many people with disabilities, just having to turn over your sensitive private health information, whoever it's going to go to, is concerning. Is not the way to build an environment of trust and a productive working environment. And people with disabilities have, in many cases, had many negative experiences in their lives stemming from the disclosure of those disabilities. And I think it's very understandable why people.
We need to try to
react
stay
badly.
within the time.
And that's all I have to say. So.
Thanks very much. I'll do some follow-ups in writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Casey. Senator Cassidy.
Dr. Ash, I'm an internist, as you, and although this is a health committee, which is not Medicaid and Medicare, nonetheless, I feel as if that which we're doing in the employer-based setting has a fairly mature science. But as I think of my patients whom I used to care for in the Louisiana public hospital system, the Medicaid patient or the uninsured, it's a bigger problem, if you will, some of these wellness issues. And if you're in Philadelphia, you probably have a practice that's somewhat similar to mine. How can we translate some of this, which we have been discussing for the workplace, into the Medicaid population, which statistically has a higher incidence of chronic disease, morbidity, et cetera, than the workplace?
Well, thanks for the question, Senator Cassidy. I think in most cases these activities can translate. I do think that Employers have a special role and a special trust connection with employees that may be not as high as the trust relationship people have with their doctor or with their hospital, but might be potentially higher than people have with their insurance carrier, and that trust is an important determinant of the success of these programs.
Let me stop you for a second, because as I think of my Medicaid patient, there's a structure associated with an employer relationship. And that structure allows them to give you 30 minutes off to go walk around the track if they have built one there. But Medicaid patients taking public transportation to their clinic appointment or cigarette smoking, and there's nothing you can do on their Medicaid to incentivize them to stop smoking, I guess I'm not seeing that it's as easily translated. And by the way, I'm willing to open this up to anybody, because to me it actually seems almost an apple and an orange.
Well, so we have run some programs that were employer-based that were designed to reduce the burden of tobacco on employees. We did 2 studies, one at General Electric and one at CVS. Both were highly successful interventions published in the New England Journal of Medicine and later adopted by those 2 companies. They reflected largely positive financial incentives delivered to workers to help them reduce the burden of tobacco. There's no reason why programs like that could not also be introduced into the Medicaid population. They're incentive-based. They were successful. We can think of translating some of the science and the learnings that we've developed from the employer setting.
Now, let me stop you, because again, you'd be familiar with the structure of Medicaid, which if it's managed care, they contract with a provider to provide a service at a certain rate. And if it is fee-for-service, you're just paying the bills as they come in. But typically, the patient is not directly impacted by this. The Indiana experiment may be a little bit different, in which they pre-funded health savings accounts. You could build on a reward for that. So are you thinking, when you say build in an incentive, and again, I open this to anyone, how would you do that for the Medicaid as commonly structured under the ACA or any other program?
Well, I'm not sure I would know how to do it as it's commonly structured, but it doesn't mean that it couldn't be rethought and that state Medicaid agencies might think about waivers or the like that would enable them to engage in those kinds of activities in order to achieve their mission. I'm not sure that they can do exactly what I just described under the rules as they are now, but under changed rules, they might be able to.
So the state could apply for a waiver asking for the flexibility to incentivize this sort of behavior, trying to translate that which you've successfully shown works for an employer, but to do it for the Medicaid population.
Yes.
I totally agree with that.
And would you elaborate, or just accept, just to agree?
Well, I don't want to take too much time, but basically it is, how do you get both programs that work, leadership and incentives into the Medicaid program, and obviously Indiana and even Ohio are doing major efforts to do that and seem to be succeeding.
So the pre-funded health savings accounts of the Indiana experiment really seem to be quite novel, but also quite effective. Folks who put in a little bit of money got a lot more put into their HSA, and that seemed to modify behavior. Is that what you're thinking of along those lines, or something even more so?
No, I was thinking about that along those lines, and there are other ways of doing that as well, but that works.
And what about things such as obesity? Cigarette smoking seems almost more tractable, if you will, than obesity, which is more intractable, it seems.
Well, one of the things is again, a culture program and multiple programs, so one program doesn't work for everyone. We have, in fact, 10 weight management programs at the Cleveland Clinic that are 62% of participants have the choice of participating in, and Weight Watchers may work for a group, and Curves may work for a group, and our own e-coaching program works for a group. But when you get 10 programs together, you can find programs that people can adopt, and in buddy systems and in groups, if you will, participate and succeed.
But this might be a program employed by the Medicaid managed care program.
Exactly.
To lower their overall cost burden.
Exactly.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Cassidy. Senator Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to start by thanking you and the ranking member for your work on your bipartisan effort to fix the healthcare system that we have. On behalf of the people of Colorado who have been waiting forever, it seems, for a bipartisan effort here, I want to express their gratitude to you for the work that you've done, and my hope that the Senate and the House and the President will work together to deal with the issue that confronts us right now with respect to the CSRs. As you pointed out, Mr. Chairman, This is a cherished 6% of the people that are insured, but it's only 6% of the people that are insured. This hearing really is about what we need to get after, which is the rising cost of healthcare in this country. And so I thank you for that as well. And whatever any of us can do to help your efforts, I hope you'll let us know. Dr. Roizen, could you describe briefly the bill that you mentioned in your testimony that Senator Portman and Senator Wyden are working on in the Finance Committee?
It basically allows Medicare to incentivize and to do the same type of thing that we do for our employees, offer programs, offer incentives to get to there, work with the primary care physician to set the trajectory to improve and to get to the goals. And if you did that, if the Cleveland Clinic dollar number and participation number goes to Medicare, and remember Medicare is 0.6% of Medicare achieve even 4 of the 6 behaviors and standards. If we did much more of that and got the 62% participation and 44 or so percent success at getting to goal, the government would save over $500 billion, maybe $1.2 trillion. One of the things we've learned is putting stress management in first, even for the Medicare population, is really important at getting change. And so we think this was an enormous opportunity, and Senators Portman and Wyden are working on this.
And the reason that we're here today in this committee is not about Medicare and Medicaid, but the 178 million Americans who are privately insured through their employer who could also benefit from the kind of incentive structures that you and Mr. Byrd have put in place.
And other parts of the program. I mean, I don't want to, it's not just incentive, it's some leadership, it's some cultural change, it is programs that help them, it literally changes the way they relate to their primary care physician. And the way you could, there have to be some insurance rule changes that this committee could work on to be able to allow the small, non-self-insured corporation to do this in a way that allows the employee to take the benefit as they go from one company to another, that allows the company to benefit after they've gotten the person healthier. So there need to be some rule changes, but those are minor, and there wouldn't be a dollar spent. Not a federal dollar needs to be spent in advance, or in fact, there isn't a ask for money from the federal government at all. It's just a rule change.
And Mr. Byrd, it's nice to see you again. I want to thank you for your leadership over many years in this area. This is going to sound a little bit off base, but I just can't resist because of what your job used to be. And the question I had for you is what you learned about what we're eating in this country in that job, and how that is connected to health and how it's changing if it's changing.
Well, I think increasingly the population is becoming more health conscious. I employ a number of millennials these days, and they're particularly careful about their nutrition. You know, when you run a supermarket chain and you have 45,000 stock keeping units, you have all kinds of products in there. And I'm a big believer in free choice, but only if you also suffer the consequences of that free choice. And so I think all of us should be able to enjoy a French fry now and then, but I think those of us that are really into nutrition and fitness understand that if we indulge, you know, we've got another, half hour to spend on the treadmill or walk after dinner. You know, one of the things that I wanted to mention about improving health, and particularly when you work on BMI, and I find that the Safeway number's extraordinary. The reason we started at 28% BMI is because all the people, they're on their feet all day. You know, we're not doing that here. We could have had a stand-up meeting and gotten healthier. But the point is that when people just diet, and I think everybody here would agree, it doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work, if I lose 20 pounds and all I did was diet, for every pound I lost a quarter pound of muscle. And muscle is more efficient at burning calories. So when you finish that diet, you know, and you go back to your old eating habits or maybe even refined eating habits, you can't eat as much in terms of calories because your burn rate has slowed down. So when I talk about an ecosystem at Safeway that we created, we stress the importance of cardiovascular workouts. We stress strength training. And you can, at the age of 60, have the burn rate of somebody in their late 20s if you do resistance training. And I contend it's the secret to weight maintenance. I would be shocked if you don't do resistance training.
I do.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Byrd. And our next wellness hearing will be a stand-up hearing. We'll see what happens.
Okay. Very good. Even if we just stand up once during the hearing, it helps.
Yeah, it does. That's true.
I'm going to be sick that day.
Yeah. Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I want to see if I can just ask some more questions along this line. We all know that the Affordable Care Act allows employers to offer financial incentives to their employees in order to encourage participation in these programs. But one thing the ACA doesn't do is eliminate the protections already in federal law for employers so that they cannot discriminate against their employees on the basis of genetic information, health status, or disability. And you know, these protections were put in place by two very important pieces of legislation, the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, or GINA. And this is a bipartisan bill. Senator Ted Kennedy worked with a number of folks on this committee. And last year, Senator Enzi and I wrote and passed new legislation strengthening GINA protections so that personally identifiable genetic information collected through federal research can never be made public. So, in short, our nation's non-discrimination laws say that employers can collect sensitive medical information from their employees only if providing that information is voluntary, meaning the employee can decide to say no. So I just want to start by asking Ms. Mathis, what types of personal health information do employers typically ask for as part of wellness programs?
So I've seen these health risk assessments ask about all manner of health and medical information on a variety of levels of detail. I'll give you some examples. Specific cancer diagnoses such as breast cancer, cervical cancer, prostate cancer, weight, height, BMI, whether you're being treated for depression or bipolar disorder, specifics about your depression, such as how many times you felt depressed in the last week, whether you had crying spells in the last week, how often you felt like people disliked you, how often you feel happy, whether you've been diagnosed with heart disease, stroke, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, angina, bronchitis, COPD, hepatitis B, obesity, high blood sugar, diabetes, or sexually transmitted diseases, to name a few, whether you're pregnant, whether you're trying to become pregnant, how old you were when you first became pregnant. And those are some of the medical things that they ask about, lots of other questions about all sorts of other life habits.
Okay, so this is some really sensitive information, and it's supposed to be voluntary to hand it over.
That's right.
So let me ask about that. Mr. Byrd, when you were the CEO at Safeway, you set up a wellness program that you called completely voluntary at the same time that families were charged $1,500 more in health care premiums if they didn't participate in the program. And in fact, I think you said that you thought the penalty wasn't high enough, and you lobbied hard to get the limits relaxed. The quote is, legislation needs to raise the federal legal limits on the size of these penalties. And I know that today you run a business that designs these kinds of penalties for other companies. So my question is, when it costs an employee $1,500 or maybe more a year to get health care coverage because they don't want to have to share this kind of confidential medical information with their boss, or because they can't pass a biometric test, I don't understand how that connects then with the rules on discrimination. It sounds a lot like discrimination.
Well, we've been tested on that numerous times, and we're never accused of discrimination during the 10-year life of the program. What you're referring to about my desire to raise those limitations that were in HIPAA, HIPAA originally in '96 allowed a 20% premium differential based on behavior. And if you look at something like smoking, the impact that smoking would have, Toby Cosgrove used to say that smoking alone would cost about $3,000 more. And I didn't say in my direct testimony, but I'll say now that in our experience, about 2/3 of, on average, 2/3 of that comes immediately back to the employees as a reward for making those standards. And so it's not like they were charged $1,500. And the $1,500 one, that would be if there was a spouse and an employee. So we think that I was questioned by by EEOC. I was questioned by the Labor Department. And at the end of a 45-minute interview, I was told that I had properly followed the letter and spirit of the law. We had not been accused of discrimination during that time period. And the person that was interviewing me actually wrote the HIPAA regs in 1996, or had a role in that, and said that if I ever opened up a Washington, D.C. office, they'd love to come work for me.
Well, I'm glad that's the case, and I'm now over time, so I want to be respectful of the time here. But I have to say, when you charge differentially $1,500 or sometimes more, and that can happen because people don't want to reveal very sensitive personal medical information, that's a penalty. And paying a penalty may be legally all right, although, as I understand it, the courts have now said that the EEOC is going to have to go back to the drawing board on the latest iteration of what the rules are. But we have not repealed our laws on discrimination. And I just want to raise the issue that I think the question about what constitutes voluntary on this kind of sensitive information is one that we've also got to keep on the table and maybe do some pushing in the other direction as well. I apologize for going over, Mr. Chairman.
May I make a quick comment? This information is not revealed with the company. It's revealed with the health plan. There's an absolute firewall between the health plan and the company. And in fact, we fire people who break that health plan because we have a tracking system. Every other health plan I know has a tracking system. If you break that firewall, you get fired.
You know, Dr. Rose, all I want to say is what the law says is that the revealing information has to be voluntary.
Oh, it is, but it's with the voluntary with the health plan.
It will cost you $1,500 if you don't reveal very sensitive medical information. I think stretches the bounds of what constitutes voluntary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Let me pursue that a little bit because my interest in this hearing, while there's several possibilities, is to take this remarkable consensus we have that the Cleveland Clinic is certainly not the only one to suggest it. The Mayo Clinic says the same, lots of people say it, that there are relatively few things that we could do that dramatically affect, about lifestyle, that dramatically affect chronic disease, and chronic disease is 84% of our health care costs, and that we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars to make a difference. And then you go to the obvious point, and Mr. Byrd has pointed out, it's not only wellness that you look at when you're looking at an employer plan, but insurance is clearly an obvious opportunity to take wellness and use employer insurance as a method of helping 178 million Americans have an opportunity to be healthier and save a lot of money for the country at the same time. So how, Mr. Byrd and Dr. Rosen, how big a problem is has it been for you in your employer plans to successfully deal with the concerns that Ms. Mathis has talked about and that Senator Warren talked about and that others have asked about? Is that a major impediment, or do you think you can deal with those and treat employees fairly?
We deal with it. We have 1,000 roughly exceptions requested by physicians who say this person, no matter what we do with them, can't get to that normal. Those are accepted and they get a different plan. So in fact, in some of the extreme examples, someone just counts the amount of water they drink bottles or glasses of water they drink a day to hit the health plan target and get the premium reduction.
So to get a premium reduction, you have the opportunity to say, I need a different standard.
The primary care provider.
I need an exception.
That's exactly right.
And that you have to have you therefore try to provide a fair process to meet that objective. Ms. Mathis, does that work? I think I heard you say it probably did, that you were more concerned about the privacy.
That's not the primary concern that we have. The primary concern is the incentives for disclosure of information.
Right. And Mr. Byrd, what would your comment be on what kind of impediment are, actually, you've talked some about it, but the reward or penalty for healthier lifestyle, has that been a problem for you?
I would say it has not been a problem, and just consider the fact that 85% of the people did opt in. And one of the reasons why I think we had such a high participation rate is I put enormous effort into communicating why this was a good idea. I reported my public earnings quarterly in a town hall meeting and in a broadcast, and I reported on the health of the organization. And, people would catch me individually and ask me some questions about it, and when they really understood it, they quickly opted into the program because, to Michael's point, there's a firewall there. And when you have a premium differential, it's you're really just risk adjusting sort of the premium for individuals, but then giving them an opportunity to change their risk profile. And we do that in life insurance, we do that in automobile insurance, and behavior really matters. And I think what I'd like the committee to really focus on is that we've got, 2 practitioners here, maybe 3, and there are very few people, I would say less than 1% of the companies in this nation that have turned back obesity, that have improved the results on blood pressure and cholesterol and smoking. And so these programs, and Michael and I have not had a chance to sort of put them out in all of their glory, they work and nothing else has. I mean, a 21% obesity rate versus the nation now close to 40.
Thank you, Mr. Byrd. We're close to time we're going to be voting in a few minutes. Dr. Ashe, I would assume, based on your behavioral research, that if we wanted to incentivize United States senators to pass an appropriation bill on time, that you would subtract from our salary instead of giving us a bonus.
Maybe so, but I think you all deserve a raise.
Well, thank you for that. But, take it under advisement. Wow. Senator Murray, do you have additional questions?
I don't. I know that Senator Franken, I think, had an additional question. Yeah. Correct. I'll just say, I know we're getting close to votes and we need to go. This has been a really good hearing, and we have a lot of work making sure we do this right. I think it's critically important, and of course, balancing workers' civil rights and privacy. But this has been a really important hearing, and I appreciate everybody being here.
Thank you, Senator Franken.
Thank you again, both, for this hearing. It's very refreshing to be talking about keeping people healthy and having a health care discussion that isn't all about structures of insurance, although this has something to do with that. I do want to talk about the National Diabetes Prevention Program, which has been very successful. Before that, I just want to return one thing on the housing thing, which is on the opioid crisis. I had a visit yesterday from, I think it was yesterday, from Boys Fort, which is a band of the Ojibwe in Minnesota. And in Minnesota, we've just had an explosion in opioid use, especially in Indian country. And in Indian country, housing is an enormous issue. And as we go into this opioid, as it's being declared a crisis and an emergency, I would really like to see like a pilot program where people who come back for treatment, especially in Indian country, have a place to go after they come. And this is not I was in Rochester, Minnesota a couple breaks ago. We did an opioid roundtable, and a woman whose daughter died, she had gotten treatment, got sober, but she went back and with her old crowd, and she is gone. And we just need to, I believe, to give people the opportunity to go to sober living facilities that are good sober living facilities. I think there's probably a distinction to be made here. But I would love to be able to pilot a program in Minnesota. I would love to do it in Minnesota, where we actually, this is national, as bad as it can be in Minnesota, in Indian country, because there's housing shortages there where people coming back from rehab can go into a sober living setting so they have secure housing and that they have people that are in their same boat and in recovery. And so instead of a peer group, which is a peer group that has a high drug use, they're having a peer group of people in their own fellowship. So that's just something I want to bring up for, yes.
Senator, just to elaborate on what I said earlier, that's exactly what we do in this philanthropic effort. In other words, they have to be sober before they come in. They get tested while they're in that safe environment.
Got to be tested.
They get constantly reinforced. And so the program works. So if there's a way to expand that, I think it has great value.
And now on the National Diabetes Prevention Program, this is something that Senator Lugar and I put in the ACA. Senator Grassley and Senator Collins have been very helpful in getting CMS to do the Medicare. What we learned is that this is a 16-week program and it was piloted at the YMCA in St. Paul and in Indianapolis. This by NIH and CDC. And this is why it was me and Senator Lugar who put it in. But what it turned out that it's 16 weeks of both nutritional training and exercise. And after 5 years, this is people who have high levels of sugar in their blood, glucose, and they were 58% less likely after 5 years to become diabetic, 70% less likely if they were over 60, which is why CMS is now in the process of implementing this so that anyone in Medicare who wants to get the diabetes prevention program will be able to take this 16-week program and have it paid for by Medicare. Can anyone speak to why this has been successful?
We've got about 20 seconds.
You get behavior change, which is consistent. You also get buddy, it's a group, so you get buddy support. You get everything that a wellness program should be, and you're targeting one of the specific high-cost things, hemoglobin A1C or diabetes, so it's a great program.
I agree. I think the diabetes prevention program is a great example of the importance of behavior change. And the fact that this can be done without medication, without financial incentives, speaks to a strong program. And it has outcomes that you've mentioned are incredible, and they are persistent. And so this I think, is an incredibly optimistic light at the end of the tunnel there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Franken, and thanks to the witnesses for coming. I agree with Senator Murray. It's been a terrific hearing. We've learned a lot. The hearing record will remain open for 10 days. Members may submit additional information within that time if they would like. The HELP Committee will meet again at 10 a.m. on Thursday, October 26th, for a hearing entitled Exploring Free Speech on College Campuses. Thank you for being here today. The committee will stand adjourned.